For centuries, they've remained hidden, buried, forgotten, waiting. What if everything we believe about the ancient world is incomplete? What if the builders of our most enigmatic monuments possessed knowledge or purpose we have yet to fathom? What if the silence of stone is not absence, but answer? Join us on a journey spanning 5 continents and 10,000 years as we spend the next 3 hours exploring 22 of the most mysterious, misunderstood, and awe-inspiring archaeological sites on Earth, places that challenge everything we thought we knew. If you haven't already, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The hills of Zhejiang province rise gently from the Ku River, draped in mist and silence, the pale morning light catching the wet surface of limestone outcroppings that have watched 10,000 years pass without comment. Beneath the cultivated fields and the quiet villages, the earth hides something that should not exist. The stone here is cold and close, and the darkness below it is total. This is Longyou, a name that has only recently entered the vocabulary of modern archaeology. Located in eastern China's Zhejiang province, the Longyou chambers are a series of enormous artificial caverns carved directly into siltstone bedrock, dating back more than 2,000 years to the period of the Qin or early Han dynasties. They were entirely unknown to the modern world until 1992, when a local farmer decided to pump out a flooded pond and discovered instead one of the most extraordinary man-made underground spaces ever found. There are at least 24 known chambers, some rising to heights of 30 meters, covering a combined area estimated at 30,000 square meters. Not a single ancient text, record, or map mentions them. What baffles archaeologists is the sheer uniformity of their construction. Every wall, every ceiling, every column bears the same precise parallel chiseling marks, spaced exactly 2 centimeters apart with an almost mechanical consistency, produced entirely, it is believed, by hand tools. The scale of excavation required the removal of an estimated 1 million cubic meters of rock. Researchers found no spoil heaps, no debris, no trace of where that rock was taken. The chambers are arranged in a deliberate pattern, separated by walls of even thickness, as though designed according to a master plan. What quarrying operation of this scale left absolutely no trace in the historical record? And where in all the world did 1 million cubic meters of stone disappear to? The civilization responsible for Longyou was, depending on the precise date of construction, either the Qin Empire, the first unified Chinese state, infamous for its monumental ambitions, including the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, or the early Han dynasty, a period of consolidation and cultural florescence. Both were capable of marshalling enormous workforces, and both are known for vast, often secretive infrastructure projects. The Qin Emperor Shi Huangdi in particular was obsessed with the underground, having constructed for himself a tomb of legendary proportions. A civilization that could bury an army of clay soldiers might conceivably quarry an underground city and choose to leave it unrecorded. Some scholars propose that the Longyou chambers served a practical function. As a quarry first, producing siltstone blocks for construction projects downstream, and then repurposed as storage facilities, military caches, or granaries. The prevailing theory suggests that the uniformity of the chisel marks reflects a highly organized labor force working to prescribed templates. Not supernatural precision, but extraordinary institutional discipline. Archaeologists believe the flooding of the chambers may have been deliberate, a method of preserving and concealing them. Others suggest that the chambers held a profound ritual significance, perhaps connected to the Chinese cosmological understanding of the underworld, the realm of ancestors, or the passage between life and death. The parallel tool marks, some have noted, mirror the patterning found on ancient Chinese bronze vessels associated with spiritual ceremony. Could the chambers have been a conduit to the world below, a symbolic threshold between the living and the dead, constructed not for storage, but for sanctity? Perhaps the darkness itself was the point, a manufactured abyss inviting communion with forces that daylight could not reach. Could it be that the Longyou chambers represent a technology of organization and precision so advanced for their era that it implies the involvement of engineering knowledge not yet attributed to this period or region? Some even wonder if the uniformity of the chisel marks, so consistent they have been compared to machine-made surfaces, suggests a lost tool or method that has since vanished from the archaeological record. Was there perhaps a body of technical knowledge, transmitted through craft guilds or imperial workshops, that achieved results indistinguishable from mechanical production? Who ordered their construction? And why was it never written down? How was the removal of 1 million cubic meters of rock accomplished without leaving a single spoil site? What does the absolute silence of the historical record mean? Oversight or deliberate erasure? Could the chambers have been used simultaneously or in sequence, and by what labor force? Did the water that filled them arrive naturally, or was it placed there? And if they were meant to be forgotten, what was it that needed so badly to be hidden? Longyou stands as a testament to the terrifying gap that separates what we know from what was done, the unbridgeable distance between the record and the reality of ancient ambition. The story of Longyou is far from over. Every new chamber that is mapped raises fresh questions. Every carefully chiseled groove is a sentence in a language we have not yet learned to read. The stone remembers. We do not. As we leave the misty hills of Zhejiang behind and journey across the Pacific to the sun-scorched coast of northern Peru, we trade underground darkness for blinding desert light. But the scale of what humanity once built and the questions that surround it remain just as vast and just as unanswered. The Peruvian desert is a place of extremes, bleached earth and punishing sun, where the dry wind carries fine silt that coats the teeth and dims the horizon to a dusty amber wash. Beside the Mochi River, where the coastal plain meets the foothills of the Andes, a colossal stepped mound rises from the flatlands like a fist pressed upward through the desert floor, its eroded flanks still bearing the geometric ghost of ancient terraces. As you stand at its base and look up, the scale of it defeats ordinary perception. This is the Huaca del Sol, the Temple of the Sun, located near the modern city of Trujillo in northern Peru, and it is one of the largest pre-Columbian structures in the entire Western Hemisphere. Built by the Mochi civilization between approximately the 1st and 8th centuries CE, it was constructed using an estimated 140 million adobe bricks. At its peak, it rose to a height of perhaps 40 meters and stretched nearly 350 meters in length. It dominated the Moche Valley for centuries, and its shadow fell over a society of extraordinary sophistication. Artists, warriors, priests, and engineers who left no written language but spoke volumes in clay. What baffles archaeologists is the method by which the pyramid was built. Researchers found that the bricks are not uniform. They are stamped with over 100 distinct maker's marks, suggesting that different communities or corporate groups contributed labor quotas, each identifiable by their mark. This meta-system of tribute labor is understood. What is perplexing is the evidence that sections of the pyramid were built non-sequentially in discontinuous episodes, with entire platforms buried and new ones raised above them over generations, as though the structure was not a finished monument, but a perpetually unfinished act. Why was this pyramid never completed in any conventional sense? And what drove successive generations to bury what their ancestors had built and begin again? The Moche were one of the most accomplished civilizations of ancient South America, flourishing along the arid northern coast of Peru for roughly 8 centuries before their society collapsed, possibly due to a catastrophic series of floods and droughts triggered by El Niño events. They were extraordinary ceramic artists, producing portrait vessels of haunting psychological realism, and they left behind elaborate murals depicting warfare, sacrifice, and supernatural beings. Their world was one of blood and transformation. They practiced ritual combat and sacrificed captive warriors, pouring their blood as offering to gods who demanded the living currency of violence. Some scholars propose that the layered episodic construction of Huaca del Sol reflects a political and religious system in which each new ruler or dynasty was required to commission a new layer of the pyramid, burying the previous platform as an act of ritual enclosure, sealing the power of the predecessor and asserting the sovereignty of the successor. The prevailing theory suggests that the structure functioned simultaneously as a royal administrative center, a ritual precinct, and a mortuary monument, accumulating sacred significance with each generation. Others suggest that the buried platforms were not merely political statements, but cosmological ones, that each layer represented a cycle of time, a death and rebirth of the sun's power, and that the pyramid as a whole was a map of temporal transformation as much as a physical structure. Could the Huaca del Sol have been a symbolic representation of the layered cosmos itself? Each buried tier, a completed age, each new surface, a reborn world. Perhaps the periodic entombment of one layer beneath another was a conduit to the ancestors, a way of keeping the dead in permanent structural dialogue with the living. Could it be that the Moche possessed an architectural philosophy so sophisticated that the very incompleteness of their greatest monument was its meaning, that a pyramid perpetually in the act of becoming was more sacred than one that was finished? Some even wonder if the maker's marks represent a lost system of communal accounting and identity so nuanced that it anticipated concepts of civic participation and collective ownership thousands of years before they were formalized elsewhere. Was there perhaps a theological imperative to prevent the monument from ever reaching final form? Was the pyramid's growth driven by religious necessity, political competition, or both? What happened to the vast treasures and offerings that must have been sealed inside each buried layer? How did the Moche coordinate a construction workforce drawn from dozens of distinct communities, each leaving their mark in brick? What did the summit of the pyramid look like at its height, and who was permitted to ascend it? And when the floods came and the Moche world began to collapse, did they add one final layer, or did they simply stop? Huaca del Sol stands as a testament to a civilization that measured time not in years, but in layers, and whose greatest monument was an argument in mud and sand about the nature of power and the passage of the sun. The pyramid still rises from the desert, half-eaten by Spanish colonial-era treasure hunters who diverted the Moche River to erode its flanks, an act of destruction as total as it was catastrophic. What was lost in that flood will never be recovered. The Moche built for eternity, and we gave them barely 16 centuries before we began to take it apart. As we leave the sun-hammered shores of northern Peru and journey northeast across 10,000 kilometers of ocean and continent, we arrive at the rugged Istrian coast of Croatia, where a different kind of builder, separated by half a world and 15 centuries, raised their own vision of permanence from the limestone cliffs above the Adriatic Sea. The Istrian Peninsula juts into the northern Adriatic like a stone thumb, its red earth threaded with olive trees and dry stone walls, the sea glittering flat and hard beneath a Mediterranean sun. On a low hilltop above the village of Rovinj, the ground is dense with tumbled limestone blocks, massive many-ton slabs fitted against one another without mortar, the wall's outer face still rising in places to the height of a man and a half. Thorn scrub fills the spaces between the stones. The smell here is of dry grass and warm rock, and something older, more mineral, beneath. This is Monkodonja, a Bronze Age hill fort in western Croatia, occupied between approximately 2000 and 1200 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with Mycenaean Greece and the late Egyptian New Kingdom. It is one of the best-preserved Bronze Age fortified settlements in all of Central Europe, and its walls, constructed from enormous dry-laid limestone blocks in a style so massive it has been called cyclopean by some researchers, enclosed a community of several hundred people for more than 800 years. It perches above the coastal plain, with a commanding view in every direction, its position chosen with military precision. What baffles archaeologists is the sophistication of its defensive architecture. Researchers found not one, but two concentric defensive walls, the outer ring reinforced by a series of projecting towers and flanking bastions that allowed defenders to cover the approach to each gate, a system of overlapping fields of fire that would not look out of place in a medieval fortress. The most perplexing discovery is that the main gate complex incorporates a funneling approach corridor, forcing any attacker to turn sideways and proceed in single file, directly beneath the walls, a design principle identical to those found in Mycenaean citadels and Hittite fortifications. What was the nature of the threat that demanded such sophisticated architecture from a community of a few hundred Bronze Age Istrians? And how did builders at the edge of the known Mediterranean world come to share defensive solutions with civilizations thousands of kilometers away? Monkodonja was built and inhabited by people whose cultural identity falls within the broader Castellieri culture of the Istrian Peninsula and the Eastern Adriatic, a network of Bronze Age hill forts scattered across the region, each commanding a strategic hilltop, each connected by a web of trade and kinship that extended throughout the Mediterranean world. These were not isolated farmers, but participants in a Bronze Age globalization. Aegean pottery has been found at Monkodonja, along with amber beads from the Baltic coast and bronze that was almost certainly worked from Cypriot copper. The community that lived here was small in population, but wide in reach. Some scholars propose that the shared defensive principles between Monkodonja and sites like Mycenae or Hattusa reflect the diffusion of military technology through Bronze Age trade networks, that ideas, like goods, moved along the same routes that carried amber and copper and olive oil. The prevailing theory suggests that the hilltop location was chosen primarily for defense and secondarily for the control of agricultural land and coastal trade routes. Archaeologists believe that the eventual abandonment of Monkodonja around 1200 BCE coincides with the broader Bronze Age collapse that destroyed civilizations from Greece to the Levant. Others suggest that the concentric walls and the carefully oriented gateways encode a symbolic geography, that the fort was arranged according to a cosmological model in which the innermost enclosure, where the elite resided, represented the sacred center of the world, and each outer ring marked a transition between the domestic and the dangerous, the known and the unknown. Could Monkodonja have been a symbolic representation of the universe rendered in limestone, each gate a threshold, each wall a boundary between states of being? Perhaps the bastions and towers were not merely tactical, but apotropaic, architecture as ritual protection, stone as prayer. Could it be that the builders of Monkodonja possessed access to a body of military and architectural knowledge transmitted through a network of Bronze Age specialists, architects, engineers, or mercenaries whose influence extended far beyond what the fragmentary trade goods can account for? Some even wonder if there existed a class of professional fortress builders in the Bronze Age Mediterranean whose knowledge moved independently of trade, carried in the memory of craftsmen who built for whoever could pay. Was there perhaps a shared architectural grammar, a set of principles so fundamental to defensive logic that they emerged independently, or were they taught? Who were Monkodonja's enemies, and why did the fort require such elaborate protection? What happened inside those inner walls? Was there a palace, a sanctuary, a royal residence? How did a community of a few hundred people sustain the labor required to build and maintain these fortifications? Did the people of Monkodonja know that their culture was collapsing along with the rest of the Bronze Age world, or did the end come without warning? And what lies beneath those tumbled stones that has not yet been excavated? Monkodonja stands as a testament to the extraordinary reach of the Bronze Age world, a world more connected, more militarized, and more architecturally sophisticated than the textbooks of a generation ago were willing to admit. Its stones are silent on the question of who laid them and why, and the thorns that grow between the ancient blocks are as close as the modern world comes to occupying the space the builders once defended. The walls remain, the names are gone. As we leave the limestone hilltops of Istria and travel inland across the Balkan Peninsula into the mountains of Bosnia and Herzegovina, we enter one of the most fiercely contested archaeological debates in the modern world, a debate about pyramids, politics, and the nature of scientific truth. The forested hills above the town of Visoko rise in shapes that are, from the right angle, almost too geometric to be natural. Steep triangular slopes that catch the afternoon light at a particular slant and seem, for a moment, to resolve into something deliberate, something built. The air here is cool and dense with pine, and the ground beneath the forest is rocky, unyielding, ancient. There is something about the geometry of these hills that the eye keeps returning to, that refuses to resolve into the merely accidental. These are the hills of Visocica and Pleshevica, and since 2005, they have been at the center of one of the most passionate and polarizing archaeological controversies in Europe. The Bosnian pyramid hypothesis, introduced by the amateur researcher Semir Osmanagic, proposes that these hills, particularly Visocica, dubbed the Pyramid of the Sun, are not natural formations, but ancient man-made structures, potentially tens of thousands of years old, making them the largest and oldest pyramids on Earth. The claims have generated intense international media coverage, significant tourist revenue for the region, and an almost unanimous rejection from the mainstream archaeological community. What baffles archaeologists on both sides of the debate is the nature of the evidence itself. Researchers found what appear to be cut stone blocks and paved surfaces on the hillsides, and beneath the forest floor, excavations have uncovered what proponents describe as man-made concrete slabs, samples of which, when tested, have been claimed to show unusual composition. The most perplexing discovery, for those sympathetic to Osmanagic's claims, is a network of underground tunnels called the Ravna tunnels, which extend beneath the hills and which have yielded carved stones with apparent megalithic inscription. Critics counter that the paved surfaces are natural geological phenomena, conglomerate and sandstone that can form flat horizontal layers through ordinary sedimentary processes. What is the stone on those hillsides, geology or archaeology? And why does the answer matter so much to so many people? The region around Visoko has a genuine and distinguished history that exists entirely independent of the pyramid hypothesis. Visoko was the medieval capital of Bosnia, a seat of power during the Kotromanic dynasty, and the hilltop of Visočica itself is the site of a documented medieval fortification, the royal town of Visoki, which gives the hills a certain historical grandeur entirely on their own terms. The broader region of Bosnia and Herzegovina has been inhabited since the Neolithic period, and genuine ancient sites, cemeteries, and settlements are scattered throughout the valleys. The desire to find something extraordinary here is understandable. The place has genuinely been important for a very long time. Some scholars propose, and this represents the overwhelming consensus of professional archaeologists and geologists, that Visočica and Preševica are natural hills, their pyramidal shapes produced by the ordinary processes of fluvial erosion and tectonic geology, which can produce strikingly geometric forms in layered sedimentary rock. The prevailing theory suggests that the flat surface stones found on the hillsides are natural formations called flat irons, and that the underground tunnels, while genuinely ancient in parts, are mining adits and natural cave systems rather than constructed megalithic passages. Archaeologists believe that the attention and funding devoted to the pyramid hypothesis has actively impeded the scientific investigation of genuine archaeological sites in the region. Others suggest, and here we enter a space beyond conventional scholarship, that the hills of Visoko encode a sacred geography deliberately aligned with cosmological principles, functioning within a tradition of landscape veneration that predates any written record. Could the tunnels have been a symbolic representation of a journey through the earth to a sacred center, regardless of whether the hills themselves were built or simply chosen? Perhaps the ritual landscape of Visoko was defined not by construction, but by recognition, the ancient inhabitants seeing in the natural geometry of these hills the hand of the divine, and responding with ceremony rather than stone. Could it be that the truth of Visoko lies not in the binary of built or natural, but somewhere in between? That a natural formation was deliberately shaped, enhanced, and incorporated into a sacred landscape by a people whose relationship with the land was one of collaboration rather than conquest. Some even wonder if the intensity of the controversy itself reflects something more than scientific disagreement, a deep, culturally specific hunger for a history that predates the traumas of recent Balkan history. Was there perhaps a civilization, unknown to current archaeology, that made deliberate use of natural pyramidal hills as focal points for a spiritual geography we do not yet understand? What would it mean for our understanding of human history if the Bosnian pyramids were proven artificial? What would it mean if the debate itself is a symptom of something, a collective hunger for belonging to a deeper past? Why do the tunnels at Ravn feel, to so many visitors, profoundly different from an ordinary cave? Could the intensive excavations of the past 2 decades have destroyed evidence, genuine medieval or earlier archaeological deposits that can never now be recovered? And what do the carved stones in the tunnels actually say? The Bosnian pyramids stand as a testament not only to the ambiguity of the landscape, but to the ambiguity of human inquiry, the difficulty of separating scientific rigor from cultural longing, professional consensus from paradigm blindness. Whether or not Visočica is a pyramid, The story of what happened when people believed it was, is itself a profound archaeological document. The hills have not changed. Our relationship to them has changed everything. As we leave the contested hillsides of Bosnia and travel northwest across the North Sea to the wind-scoured Orkney archipelago of northern Scotland, we encounter a monument whose ancient purpose is genuinely documented in the sky above it, in the architecture of solstice light. The Orkney Islands in midwinter are a place of profound austerity, flat agricultural land under a sky of pewter and slate, the wind coming in hard off the North Atlantic, carrying a cold that has no mercy in it. The grass is a bruised green, the stone walls ancient and low, and scattered across the landscape are the standing stones and burial mounds of a people who lived here 5,000 years ago and built monuments that still define the horizon. In a field near the village of Stennis, a large grass-covered mound rises from the level plain, its surface unassuming, its interior extraordinary. This is Maeshowe, a Neolithic chambered cairn on the Orkney mainland in northern Scotland, constructed around 2800 BCE and considered one of the finest megalithic structures in Europe. It was built by the same culture responsible for the nearby ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stennis, a Neolithic community whose architectural ambitions exceeded almost anything else being produced in the world at the time. The interior chamber, approached through a low, tight passage of perfectly fitted dry stone masonry, is a masterwork of spatial engineering. 4 great stone slabs, weighing many tons each, were transported from quarries kilometers away and erected with millimetric precision. The quality of the stonework has astonished every expert who has examined it. What baffles archaeologists is the precise astronomical alignment of the entrance passage, and what it reveals about the sophistication of Neolithic observation. Researchers found that on the days surrounding the winter solstice, the setting sun sends a beam of light directly down the passage and illuminates the back wall of the inner chamber, a phenomenon that lasts only a few weeks each year and requires an alignment accuracy of less than a degree. The most perplexing element is that this alignment was not accidental. The builders had to have observed the solstice sun's position, planned the passage orientation in advance, and constructed it to tolerances that suggest months or years of careful astronomical monitoring. Who, 5,000 years ago, was measuring the sky with this precision? And what were they communicating to, or about, the dead buried within? Maeshowe belongs to the cultural tradition archaeologists call the grooved ware culture, a Neolithic people who occupied Britain and Ireland from roughly 3,200 to 2,200 BCE, and who were responsible for the most extraordinary megalithic building program in European prehistory. They raised Stonehenge, Avebury, and the Orkney monuments in a sustained burst of sacred architectural energy that has no obvious parallel. These were farming communities, their lives organized around the rhythms of cattle, grain, and sea, but their spiritual investment in stone and sky was total. Death was not an ending in their cosmology, but a transition. The dead were placed in the earth, not to be forgotten, but to be incorporated into the land's sacred geography. Some scholars propose that the winter solstice alignment at Maeshowe served a practical ceremonial function, that the annual illumination of the chamber was the occasion for rituals of remembrance and renewal, a moment when the living could enter the presence of the dead under the specific guaranteed light of the turning sun, signaling the promise of returning warmth and the continuation of the agricultural year. The prevailing theory suggests that the structure functioned as a communal tomb, a monument to collective ancestral identity, and that the astronomical alignment gave its annual use a precise temporal rhythm. Others suggest that the solstice light entering Maeshowe was not merely ceremonial but transformative, that the penetration of the sun's beam into the stone chamber was understood as a literal act of divine insemination, the Sun Father entering the Earth Mother through the stone passage, generating the renewal of life. Could the chamber have been a symbolic representation of the cosmic womb, the entrance passage a birth canal, and the annual illumination a reenactment of a creation myth older than language? Perhaps this was a conduit between the solar realm and the realm of the dead, a point where the two touched each other briefly each winter, exchanging something essential. Could it be that the builders of Maeshowe possessed astronomical knowledge accumulated over generations of systematic sky observation, a calendar science as rigorous in its own terms as any formal astronomy, and that this knowledge was encoded not in writing, but in stone? Some even wonder if the precision of the Maeshowe alignment implies the existence of a specialist class of astronomer priests whose sole function was the observation, prediction, and architectural translation of celestial events. Was there perhaps a tradition of Neolithic scientific inquiry as disciplined and cumulative as anything in the ancient world? How many generations of observation were needed before the builders could plan and execute the Maeshowe alignment? Were the dead interred within the chamber, chosen specifically for their connection to the sun's cycle? Kings, priests, or calendar keepers? What was the ritual experience of entering that dark passage and watching the solstice beam travel across the floor toward you? How did the community gather, outside in the winter cold, watching the entrance for the moment when the light appeared? And why, after centuries of use, was Maeshowe sealed and buried beneath a grass mound, its interior left to the dark? Maeshowe stands as a testament to the desire of the Neolithic human mind to make the cosmos legible, to anchor the terrifying movement of the stars in stone, to give death an address on the turning year. It was broken into by Norse settlers in the 12th century CE, who left runic inscriptions on its walls, including, memorably, the complaint that the treasure they had hoped to find was already gone. They found no gold, no jewels. They found only the stone and the dark. Perhaps the treasure was always the light. As we leave the windswept Orkneys and travel south along the coast of Cornwall, we encounter a different kind of Neolithic monument, not hidden beneath a mound, but standing openly in a field, 19 granite figures in a perfect circle, facing each other across 5,000 years of silence. In the far southwest tip of England, where the land narrows to a granite knuckle above the Atlantic, the fields are small and hedged with stone, the light silver grey and sea-filtered, the wind permanent and mild. The moorland here has a quality of immense age. The peat bogs and granite tors have been here since before any human memory, and scattered among them, if you know how to look, are the relics of the people who first decided that this edge of the world was worth inhabiting. In a gentle field alongside the B3315 road in Cornwall, 19 granite stones stand in a circle so precise it seems impossible it was made by unaided human hands. This is the Merry Maidens, a Neolithic or early Bronze Age stone circle in the Land's End Peninsula of Cornwall, England, constructed approximately 4,000 years ago, and considered one of the most perfectly preserved and geometrically regular stone circles in the British Isles. All 19 standing stones survive intact, arranged in a circle approximately 24 meters in diameter, with a regularity that suggests careful geometric planning. They are relatively modest in height, the tallest reaching only about 1.25 meters, but their evenness and completeness give the site an uncanny stillness, a sense that the arrangement is waiting for something that has not yet arrived. What baffles archaeologists is the precision of the circle's geometry and the question of what cognitive and instrumental tools the builders used to achieve it. Researchers found that the Merry Maidens circle is not a rough approximation, but a near-perfect geometric figure, a precision that would require some method of fixing a center point and measuring radial distances with consistency across the full circumference. The most perplexing discovery is that similar geometric precision is found at dozens of stone circles across the British Isles, suggesting not accidental regularity, but a shared geometric tradition, perhaps a transmitted craft knowledge that crossed tribal and regional boundaries. What instrument, what technique, or what body of mathematical knowledge allowed Neolithic builders to inscribe a near-perfect circle in an open field? And was the circle itself the monument, or merely the container for something else? The people who built the Merry Maidens lived during the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, a period of profound cultural change in the British Isles as new peoples, new technologies, and new religious ideas arrived from continental Europe. They were farmers and herders, their lives closely tied to the seasonal rhythms of planting and lambing. But they invested enormous collective energy in the construction of ritual monuments, henges, stone circles, avenues, and barrows that suggest a rich and organized spiritual life. The tradition of the stone circle in this period extended across the British Isles and into Ireland and Brittany, forming a shared cultural vocabulary of sacred space. Some scholars propose that the Merry Maidens served as a ritual gathering place, a demarcated sacred zone within which community ceremonies, seasonal festivals, or astronomical observations were conducted. The prevailing theory suggests that the circle's precise geometry reflects a tradition of sacred geometry in which the circle itself, as a form, had cosmological significance, a representation of wholeness, of the horizon, of the eternal return. Archaeologists believe the site was probably used for communal ritual over many generations, and that its persistence in the landscape reflects ongoing community investment in maintaining a shared sacred space. Others suggest that the 19 stones represent a cosmological counting system, a solar or lunar calendar encoded in the number and spacing of the megaliths, each stone marking a significant day or interval in the agricultural or astronomical year. Could the Merry Maidens have been a symbolic representation of the community itself? 19 founding ancestors, perhaps, or 19 clan groupings rendered in stone so that the dead could perpetually participate in the ritual life of the living. Perhaps this was a conduit between the human community and the cosmic order, a place where the boundary between the two was made temporarily permeable. Could it be that the builders of the Merry Maidens and of the dozens of similarly precise stone circles scattered across Britain possessed a tradition of geometric measurement that has left no trace in the archaeological record beyond the monuments themselves? A lost mathematical practice as sophisticated as anything in the ancient world. Some even wonder if the consistent precision of British stone circles implies the existence of a professional class of sacred architects or surveyors who moved between communities, standardizing sacred geometry across a vast cultural network. Was there perhaps a geometric canon, a sacred rulebook for the construction of circles that was transmitted orally and is now entirely lost. How was the exact center of the circle marked during construction? Were the 19 stones chosen for their specific shapes, sizes, or visual relationships with each other? Was the interior of the circle considered sacred space that could not be entered except at specific times by specific people for specific purposes? What happened at the Merry Maidens during the centuries of its use? And why, at some point, did people stop using it? And what does the local folk tradition that the stones are petrified dancing girls, turned to granite for the sin of dancing on the Sabbath, preserve from an older, more genuinely sacred memory? The Merry Maidens stand as a testament to the human impulse to make a circle in the world, to draw a line around the sacred, to mark a boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary, to say, here is the center, and we have found it. They have been standing for 4,000 years through rain and frost and the slow drift of cultural memory. Whatever they once meant, they mean something still. You can feel it when you walk among them. The sense that you have stepped briefly out of time. As we leave the granite fields of Cornwall and cross the Tyrrhenian Sea to the island of Sardinia, we find another culture, another stone, another mystery. This time in the dry uplands of a Mediterranean island where the Bronze Age left monuments that defy easy categorization. The interior of Sardinia is a world apart from the tourist coastline. A rocky, sun-bleached upland of maquis scrub and basalt outcroppings, where the air in summer is hot and aromatic with wild herbs and where the silence is interrupted only by the occasional bell of a wandering goat. The plateau above Olmedo in northwestern Sardinia commands a wide view of the surrounding countryside, and on its surface, among the stones and the thorn bushes, the remnants of something ancient and deliberate slowly emerge as your eyes learn to distinguish the worked from the natural. This is Monte Baranta, a Bronze Age megalithic complex in the province of Sassari on the island of Sardinia, dated to approximately 2,700 to 2,400 BCE and belonging to the pre-Nuragic Abialzu Filigosa culture. It is one of the most enigmatic prehistoric sites in the Western Mediterranean, comprising a series of massive stone structures, including what appears to be a defensive wall, a bastioned gateway, and a number of standing stones that have been interpreted variously as a fortified settlement, a ceremonial precinct, and something that sits uncomfortably between the two. It predates the great Nuragic civilization of Sardinia, which built the island's famous towers by several centuries, and its relationship to that later culture remains poorly understood. What baffles archaeologists is the defensive character of the architecture at a period before defensive architecture had become widespread in the Western Mediterranean. Researchers found a massive curving wall constructed from enormous limestone blocks, reinforced by projecting bastions at regular intervals, a layout strikingly similar to fortifications found in contemporary sites in mainland Iberia and the Greek Early Bronze Age. The most perplexing discovery is the sheer scale of the effort required to construct Monte Baranta by a culture that appears, from the rest of the archaeological record, to have been a relatively small, loosely organized pastoral society. Who or what was this community defending against? And what were they protecting that was valuable enough to require fortifications on this scale? The people who built Monte Baranta inhabited Sardinia during a transitional period between the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, a time of increasing social complexity, emerging hierarchy, and intensifying contact with cultures across the Western Mediterranean. Sardinia in this period was not isolated. It was a node in a network of sea routes that connected Iberia, southern France, northern Italy, and the central Mediterranean, and the island's copper and obsidian made it a source of material wealth that attracted and generated long-distance exchange. The Abil-Su Filigosa culture appears to have been the product of this intensifying contact. A society in the process of transformation from egalitarian farming community to something more hierarchical, more militarized, and more architecturally ambitious. Some scholars propose that Monte Baranta was a fortified refuge, a place to which the surrounding pastoral communities could retreat with their animals and goods in times of conflict, and that the standing stones within the enclosure served as cultic focuses for the ceremonies that reinforced community identity and solidarity in times of threat. The prevailing theory suggests that the bastioned wall reflects the arrival in Sardinia of architectural ideas from mainland Iberia, where similar fortifications appear at roughly the same period, carried by the same networks of exchange that moved copper and ornaments across the sea. Others suggest that Monte Baranta's enclosure was primarily a sacred rather than a defensive space, that the massive walls were not intended to keep enemies out, but to define and demarcate a zone of heightened spiritual power, within which the relationship between the living community and its ancestors or gods was ritually maintained. Could the standing stones within the enclosure have been a symbolic representation of ancestral presences, the dead made permanent in stone, standing witness to the ceremonies of the living? Perhaps this was a conduit to a sacred dimension of the landscape, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin enough to touch. Could it be that Monte Baranta represents the physical expression of a social transformation so rapid and so profound that it required a new kind of space, neither purely domestic nor purely ceremonial, but something genuinely new, a Bronze Age innovation in sacred architecture that reflected an equally innovative conception of community identity and territorial claim? Some even wonder if the builders of Monte Baranta had direct contact with peoples from the Iberian Peninsula who brought with them not just architectural techniques, but an entire social and religious complex, and that what we see at Monte Baranta is the Sardinian adaptation of a continental idea. Was there perhaps a horizon of shared sacred architecture stretching from Portugal to Sardinia, built by peoples who never met but shared a common grammar of stone? What was Monte Baranta defending? Land, people, animals, or sacred objects? Who were the inhabitants of this upland site, and how did they relate to the valley communities below? What rituals took place around the standing stones, and who was permitted to witness them? How long was the site in active use, and what caused it to be abandoned? And what lies beneath the surface of the plateau that the excavations have not yet uncovered? Monte Baranta stands as a testament to the restless ingenuity of Bronze Age Sardinia, an island that has always absorbed and transformed what the Mediterranean world brought to its shores, producing something always distinctly its own. The bastions on the hilltop have been standing for 4,500 years, watching the light change over the Sardinian interior, and they will continue to stand long after all the questions we bring to them have been replaced by different questions. That is the nature of stone. It outlasts inquiry. As we leave the sun-baked uplands of Sardinia and journey northeast to the Indus Valley, we cross 3,000 kilometers and move from a relatively small, peripheral Bronze Age community into the heart of one of the ancient world's great urban civilizations, a civilization that raised cities of extraordinary sophistication and left behind storehouses whose true function has been contested for decades. The Punjab in summer is a landscape of liquid heat and flat, alluvial immensity, the river plain extending to every horizon under a sky bleached white, the air shimmering above the baked earth, the Ravi River in the distance a silver thread in the haze. The modern city and the ancient one share the same name here, Harappa, and the mound that represents 4,000 years of accumulated occupation rises above the surrounding plain with a quietly monumental authority. As you stand on its edge and look down at the exposed mud brick courses of the ancient city, you are looking at a civilization that knew things about urban planning that the rest of the world would not rediscover for 2 millennia. Harappa is one of the 2 great metropolises of the Indus Valley civilization, the other being Mohenjo-Daro to the south, and at its height, around 2600 to 1900 BCE, it housed a population of perhaps 60,000 people in a grid-planned city equipped with a public water supply, a sewage system, standardized weights and measures, and a degree of social organization that has no clear parallel in the ancient world. The Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, extended across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, encompassing hundreds of settlements from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea. It is, by any measure, one of the 3 great cradles of urban civilization, and it remains the least understood. What baffles archaeologists is a series of massive mud brick platforms on the northern edge of Harappa that were long identified as granaries, storehouses for the surplus grain that fed the city and sustained the state. Researchers found a complex of enormous parallel structures, each raised on a mud brick plinth, with what appeared to be ventilation ducts running beneath, a design consistent with grain storage, where airflow beneath the floor prevents moisture accumulation and preserves the harvest. The most perplexing discovery is that no actual grain, not a single carbonized seed in quantity, has been found within these structures. The ventilation ducts beneath some platforms have been reinterpreted as ordinary construction features with no specific storage function. Was this the granary of a great city or something else entirely? And if not a granary, then what does the architectural investment in these structures actually represent? The Indus Valley civilization stands apart from every other ancient urban culture in its apparent egalitarianism. No great palaces have been found, no royal tombs, no colossal statues of rulers, no militaristic imagery. The standardization of weights and bricks across thousands of kilometers implies a high degree of centralized coordination, but the nature and location of the coordinating authority remains invisible in the archaeological record. This is a civilization that fed and housed hundreds of thousands of people with apparent efficiency, traded with Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, and maintained urban infrastructure of extraordinary complexity, yet left no identifiable rulers, no warrior class, and no obvious mechanism of coercion. How was the surplus managed in a city without apparently a king? Some scholars propose that the Harappa platforms served multiple functions simultaneously, as grain storage during times of surplus, as processing areas for agricultural produce, and as the institutional center of a redistributive economy in which the community collectively managed and distributed its resources. The prevailing theory suggests that the ventilation features are real, functional, and consistent with storage, and that the absence of grain residue reflects post-abandonment scavenging and the decay of organic material over 4,000 years rather than an absence of original function. Others suggest that the large platforms at Harappa were not primarily economic structures but ceremonial ones, raised platforms for public gathering, ritual distribution, or the performance of communal religious obligations. Could the structures have been a symbolic representation of the communal surplus itself, not merely a place to store grain, but a monument to the act of collective provision, a sacred space where the community's relationship with food, land, and cosmic abundance was ritually enacted? Perhaps this was a conduit between the city's productive capacity and the divine or ancestral forces that were understood to guarantee it. Could it be that the Indus Valley civilization operated according to principles of social and economic organization so different from those of its contemporary civilizations that our categories, granary, palace, temple, treasury, simply do not map onto its architecture? Some even wonder if the absence of royal symbolism represents not the absence of hierarchy, but a deliberate cultural suppression of it. A society that had chosen, consciously or structurally, to make power invisible. Was there perhaps a ruling class at Harappa whose authority was expressed not in monuments, but in the management of information, resources, and ritual? A bureaucratic sovereignty that left no statues because it had no need of them. What was stored in the Harappa platforms and who controlled access to it? How did a city of 60,000 people organize the collection, distribution, and accounting of agricultural surplus without a visible central authority? Why does the Indus script, found on thousands of seals and tablets, remain undeciphered? And what would deciphering it tell us about the platforms? What happened to the Indus Valley civilization's administrative class when the cities began to decline around 1900 BCE? And where did they go? Harappa stands as a testament to a civilization that organized complexity on a massive scale and left behind almost no clue as to how it was done. The platforms at its northern edge are still standing, still unresolved, still waiting for the archaeologist who will finally ask the right question. Whatever they stored it well enough to outlast the civilization that built them. Whatever that says about Harappa, it says something true about stone and mud, and the tenacity of what human beings choose to build. As we leave the alluvial plains of the Punjab and travel southwest across the Indian Ocean and up the eastern coast of Africa, we arrive at a very different kind of civilization, one built not from mud brick and fired clay, but from the coral stone of the Swahili coast, in a city that once commanded the trade of an entire ocean. The Swahili coast of Tanzania smells of salt and decay and something floral. The sea pressing in from the east, the mangroves along the shore holding the mud in a tangle of roots, the air heavy with tropical moisture and the sound of birds. The island of Songo Mnara, in the Kilwa archipelago off the southern Tanzanian coast, is barely a kilometer long, its interior choked with baobab trees and dense vegetation, and beneath the canopy, the coral stone ruins rise in haunting, roofless silence, wall after wall after wall of a city that was once one of the wealthiest on the Indian Ocean. Songo Mnara is a Swahili stone town on the Tanzanian coast, flourishing at its peak between the 14th and 16th centuries CE, and constituting one of the best preserved examples of Swahili urban architecture on the East African coast. It was a satellite town of the great city of Kilwa Kisiwani, once described by the Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta as among the most beautiful cities in the world, and it participated in the Indian Ocean trade network that connected East Africa with Arabia, India, Persia, and China. Its coral stone houses, mosques, and palaces were built by a sophisticated Islamic merchant culture that had grown wealthy on gold from the Zimbabwean plateau, and its ruins cover an area of several hectares packed with standing structures of extraordinary completeness. What baffles archaeologists is the spatial organization of Songo Mnara's urban fabric. Researchers found that the town's layout does not conform to any simple hierarchical model. The large stone houses and the mosque are not clustered in an elite quarter, but distributed across the settlement in a pattern that suggests a more complex social geography than the simple division between rich and poor. The most perplexing discovery is the network of open spaces, courtyards, plazas, and interconnecting passages that weave between the houses in a manner suggesting deliberate design but resisting easy functional interpretation. Were these spaces markets, ceremonial areas, domestic extensions, or something else? And how did a relatively small island community sustain the density of stone construction visible in the ruins? The Swahili civilization of the East African coast was one of the great urban cultures of the medieval Indian Ocean world. Neither purely African nor purely Arabian, but a synthesis of both, born from centuries of maritime contact, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. The Swahili merchant elite converted to Islam from the 10th century onwards and built mosques and stone houses that marked their participation in the wider Islamic world. But their material culture, their genetic heritage, and their relationship to the African interior all attest to deep roots in Bantu-speaking East Africa. They were middlemen of extraordinary sophistication, collecting gold, ivory, and enslaved people from the interior and exchanging them for Indian cotton, Chinese porcelain, and Persian glass. Some scholars propose that the spatial complexity of Songo Mnara reflects a highly articulated social hierarchy in which different categories of house, distinguished by size, ornamentation, and position, corresponded to different ranks within the merchant community. The prevailing theory suggests that the open spaces functioned as semi-public gathering areas where the boundaries of hospitality, commerce, and social display were negotiated. Archaeologists believe that the town was probably abandoned relatively rapidly in the 16th century, possibly following Portuguese disruption of the Indian Ocean trade networks that had sustained it. Others suggest that the layout of Songo Mnara encoded a cosmological geography, that the orientation of the houses, the placement of the mosque, and the distribution of the open spaces all reflected an Islamic conception of sacred urban space, in which the individual household, the communal mosque, and the open plaza together constituted a microcosm of the divine order. Could the coral stone walls of Songo Mnara have been a symbolic representation of the Islamic city ideal, the house as private sanctuary, the mosque as cosmic axis, and the street as the space where divine order meets human negotiation? Perhaps this was a conduit between the earthly city and the celestial one, built in the perishable medium of coral stone, because the builders understood that all earthly things were ultimately temporary. Could it be that the spatial organization of Songo Mnara represents a form of urban intelligence, an accumulated knowledge of how to build a resilient, socially cohesive community in a challenging environment that was entirely oral and practical, transmitted through the craft traditions of Swahili masons, and is now entirely unrecoverable? Some even wonder if the open spaces were not planned at all, but were the product of a long process of incremental negotiation between households over the use of shared land. An emergent urban form that looks planned from above, but was actually the result of thousands of small decisions made over generations. Was there perhaps a Swahili conception of public space so different from European or Middle Eastern models that we are misreading its ruins through the wrong analytical lens? Who lived in the largest houses of Songo Mnara? And what was their relationship to the merchants of Kilwa Kisiwani? What goods were stored, traded, and displayed in the courtyards and open spaces? How did the island's population sustain itself? Was food grown locally or imported from the mainland? What happened to the population when the Portuguese disrupted the trade networks? Did they migrate, resist, or simply disperse into the interior? And what lies beneath the coral stone floors that the excavations have not yet reached? Songo Mnara stands as a testament to a civilization that built beauty in a hard material, in a difficult environment, at the junction of two worlds, the African interior and the Indian Ocean, and made from that junction something extraordinary and lasting. The coral stone crumbles slowly in the humid air, the roots of the baobabs slowly disassembling the walls their shade once protected, and the sea that once brought wealth and connection and Chinese porcelain now brings tourists and researchers and the gentle, insatiable erosion of time. As we leave the coral island of the Swahili coast and travel north across the Sahara to the high plains of northeastern Algeria, we enter a landscape of stone, so ancient and so vast that the megalithic monuments scattered across it seem almost incidental, and yet the Dolmen of Roknia is anything but. The Algerian highlands east of Constantine are a landscape of arid limestone and scrubby vegetation, the plateau broken by dry wadis and eroded hills under a sky of intense mineral blue. The light here is unforgiving, bleaching the pale stone to near white by midday, casting long shadows at dawn and dusk that give the landscape a stark, almost lunar geometry. And on the high ground above the Roknia, spread across several square kilometers of this ancient plateau, thousands of stone tomb structures cluster in a density that seems, at first encounter, impossible. This is the Dolmen field of Roknia, a megalithic necropolis in the Guelma region of northeastern Algeria, containing an estimated 3,000 to 7,000 dolmens and megalithic tomb structures spread across the high limestone plateau, making it one of the largest concentrations of megalithic monuments in the entire world. Dating broadly to the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age periods, roughly from 3000 to 1000 BCE, the field was in use for a very long time by the ancient Berber-speaking populations of North Africa. The scale of the site is staggering. Thousands of stone chambers, each built to house the dead, covering a landscape that extends further than the eye can take in. What baffles archaeologists is the sheer density and duration of the funerary investment at Roknia. Researchers found that the dolmens are not uniform in type, but vary considerably in size, construction technique, and orientation, suggesting that the field was used by multiple generations and perhaps multiple communities over a period of centuries or millennia. The most perplexing discovery is that despite the enormous number of structures, the associated settlement evidence is sparse. No corresponding ancient city or large village has been identified nearby that could account for the population required to produce this many dead over this many centuries. Who were the thousands buried here? Where did they live? And why did this particular plateau become the chosen place of the dead for so large a community across so many generations? The people who built and used the Roknia field were the Berber-speaking ancestors of the modern North African population, a people who have inhabited the Maghreb continuously since the Paleolithic, and whose culture, in the prehistoric period, participated in the broader Mediterranean megalithic tradition while maintaining distinctly North African characteristics. The North African megalithic tradition is closely related to, but distinct from, that of the European Atlantic coast. The dolmens of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia share certain architectural features with the megaliths of Iberia and France, but diverge in others, raising questions about shared origins versus parallel development. Some scholars propose that the Roknia field served as a regional cemetery, a designated sacred landscape to which communities from a wide geographic area brought their dead, in the same way that certain medieval cemeteries in Europe served multiple towns and villages across a large catchment area. The prevailing theory suggests that the concentration of tombs reflects the prestige of the site. Its association with ancestral burials over many generations may have made it increasingly attractive as a burial place, reinforcing its sacred status through accumulated use. Archaeologists believe that many of the dolmens have been robbed of their original contents, making the full picture of who was buried here and with what grave goods very difficult to reconstruct. Others suggest that the Roknia Plateau was chosen for burial, not for practical reasons, but for cosmological ones. That its elevated position, its orientation relative to the horizon, or its specific geological character, made it a place where the boundary between the living world and the ancestral realm was considered especially thin. Could the field of thousands of dolmens have been a symbolic representation of a city of the dead, a parallel community of ancestors whose collective presence was believed to sustain and protect the living, who visited, maintained, and continued to bury among them? Perhaps this was a conduit to a realm of ancestral power so profound that generations of communities willingly invested the enormous labor of megalith construction to gain access to it. Could it be that the Roknia field represents a form of landscape-scale funerary architecture whose logic escapes us because we are applying categories of urban and non-urban, local and regional, that do not match the social geography of the Bronze Age Maghreb? Some even wonder if the variation in dolmen style across the field represents not different generations, but different communities, a shared sacred space, used simultaneously by multiple distinct groups, each building according to its own tradition, creating over time a landscape of deliberate architectural diversity. Was there perhaps a covenant between communities, a shared investment in a single sacred place, that constituted a form of political alliance expressed in stone and death? How long was the Roknia field in continuous use, and at what point did the practice of building there cease? How far did communities travel to bury their dead on this plateau? What was the experience of visiting the field during its active period? A landscape of hundreds or thousands of visible tomb structures with the sounds of lamentation and ceremony. Who maintained the field, cleared the undergrowth, and kept the paths between the tombs passable? And what was the last burial at Roknia, and who witnessed it? The dolmen of Roknia, more properly the dolmen field, stands as a testament to the endurance of the human desire to give death a permanent address in the landscape. 3,000 to 7,000 stone chambers, each built to last, together constitute one of the most extraordinary funerary landscapes on Earth, and most of them have never been properly excavated. The answers they contain are still there, sealed in stone, waiting in the Algerian sun. That patience should shame us. As we leave the high plateau of northeastern Algeria and travel northwest to the green hills of Asturias in northern Spain, we trade the desert for mist and the flat limestone plateau for an Atlantic hill fort, a place where Iron Age Celts looked out over the sea and built a world they clearly intended to keep. The coast of Asturias in northern Spain is a landscape of extraordinary green, vivid, rain-fed, oceanic, the Atlantic pushing its dampness deep into the river valleys and giving the hillsides a lushness that feels almost tropical compared to the dry interior of the peninsula. The Navia River cuts south through forested hills, and on a hilltop above its western bank, the circular stone walls of an ancient settlement emerge from the grass, dozens of them, house foundations packed together within a defensive perimeter, the whole overlooking a river valley that has been inhabited without interruption since the first people found their way here from the south. This is Castro de Coaña, an Iron Age hill fort settlement in western Asturias, northwestern Spain, occupied from approximately the 4th century BCE to the 1st century CE, and considered one of the best preserved Celtic hill forts on the Iberian Peninsula. It was the home of the Astures, one of the pre-Roman Celtic-speaking peoples of northern Iberia, and its ruins preserve the foundations of some 50 circular stone dwellings arranged in clusters within a complex system of defensive walls and ditches. It commands a strategic position above the Navia River, visible from a great distance, and its occupants would have been able to see both upriver and down, watching the valley's traffic with the confidence of people who had chosen their ground well. What baffles archaeologists is the relationship between the domestic and the sacred at Coaña. Researchers found, amid the tightly packed round house foundations, a structure that has been interpreted as a possible sauna or sweat lodge, a stone chamber with a central hearth and apparent provision for the production of steam that has no clear parallel in other Iberian Celtic settlements. The most perplexing discovery is that this structure, if correctly interpreted, suggests a ritual bathing practice with possible shamanistic or purification functions, connecting the Astures to a wider Atlantic Celtic tradition of ritual water use found in Ireland, Scotland, and Gaul. What was the specific ritual function of steam in the spiritual life of this hilltop community? And what does its presence tell us about a religious life that left almost no other direct evidence? The Astures, who built and inhabited Castro de Coaña, were part of the broad cultural continuum of Atlantic Celtic peoples who occupied the western fringes of Europe from the Iron Age through the Roman period. They were farmers, herders, and warriors, their society organized around kinship groups and the authority of local chiefs, their religious life centered on sacred natural places, springs, rivers, groves, and a pantheon of gods whose names survive in Roman-era dedicatory inscriptions. They were not passive witnesses to the Roman conquest of Iberia, but fierce and prolonged resistors. The Cantabrian Wars of 29 to 19 BCE, which finally brought the north under Roman control, were among the most difficult military campaigns the Roman army ever conducted. Some scholars propose that the apparent sauna or steam chamber at Coaña was part of a social healing practice, a place where the community gathered for purification, therapeutic treatment, and the maintenance of social bonds, in a tradition similar to the sweat lodges documented among Celtic peoples in Ireland and the sauna traditions of Northern Europe. The prevailing theory suggests that the hilltop location of Coaña was chosen for a combination of defensive and symbolic reasons. The high ground provided military advantage, but also connected the settlement visually to the sky, the horizon, and the wider sacred geography of the Asturian landscape. Others suggest that the ritual steam chamber was a threshold space, a place where the membrane between the human world and the spirit world was deliberately thinned through heat, darkness, and the disorientation of the body, allowing for altered states of consciousness in which communication with the dead or the divine became possible. Could the steam chamber at Coaña have been a symbolic representation of the womb of the earth, a dark, warm, enclosed space from which the participant emerged, transformed, reborn, their perception of ordinary reality temporarily dissolved? Perhaps this was a conduit to the ancestral spirits whose bones lay in the ground of the surrounding hills, accessible only through the threshold of heat and darkness. Could it be that the sauna tradition at Coaña represents the survival, in the Atlantic Celtic world, of a very ancient shamanistic practice whose roots extend back to the Neolithic or even the Upper Paleolithic, a practice of deliberately induced altered states as a technology for navigating the spiritual world? Some even wonder if the concentration of sweat lodge evidence in the Atlantic fringe, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, Brittany, reflects not cultural diffusion, but an independent convergence on the same spiritual technology by peoples who shared a deep structural similarity in their relationship to water, heat, and the transformative body. Was there perhaps a pan-Atlantic Celtic spirituality more coherent and systematic than our fragmented evidence allows us to describe? Who had access to the steam chamber at Coaña? Everyone or only the ritually qualified? How long were sessions within the chamber, and what happened to participants during and after? What was the experience of living in a settlement this dense, this tightly packed, 50 families within a single perimeter wall, their lives almost entirely public? How did the Asturas of Coaña experience the arrival of Roman power in the valley? And what was lost when the hilltop was abandoned for the valley floor? And why, having built something so enduring and so well considered, did they ultimately choose to come down from the hill? Castro de Coaña stands as a testament to the ingenuity and tenacity of the Celtic peoples of northern Iberia, a people who resisted the most powerful military machine in the ancient world for decades, who built their homes in stone on the highest ground they could find, and who maintained a rich spiritual life in a landscape that rewarded attentiveness to water, fire, and the spirit of place. The roundhouse foundations are still there, the valley still visible from the hilltop, the Navia River still running below. The Astures are gone, the stone remains. As we leave the green hills of Asturias and travel to the opposite extreme of the Mediterranean world, to the sun-hammered sandstone cliffs of the Nile Valley in southern Egypt, we encounter a very different kind of sacred landscape, one carved directly into the living rock of the river's edge. Where the Nile narrows between towering sandstone cliffs in southern Egypt, the river seems to gather itself, the water deep and swift between the amber walls, the light bouncing off both the rock and the water in a blinding compound of gold. This is one of the most dramatic passages of the Nile Valley, and it has been sacred for as long as anyone has cared to record. The cliffs of Gebel el-Silsila rise on both banks, and their surfaces are covered, from the waterline to the highest accessible point, with inscriptions, reliefs, and carved chambers, thousands of them layered across 30 centuries of continuous religious use. Gebel el-Silsila, Arabic for Mountain of the Chain, is a sandstone outcrop site on the Nile in Aswan Governorate in Upper Egypt, situated approximately 65 kilometers north of Aswan, and it represents one of the most extensive and continuously used sacred sites in the entire ancient Egyptian world. Active from the New Kingdom period, approximately 1550 BCE, through the Greco-Roman era and beyond, It served simultaneously as a massive quarry, a site of royal and priestly commemoration, and a place of active religious pilgrimage for the annual Nile flood ceremony. The site encompasses speos temples carved directly into the cliff, hundreds of commemorative stelae, rock-cut shrines, and tens of thousands of graffiti left by workers, soldiers, priests, and pilgrims across 3,500 years. What baffles archaeologists is the extraordinary density and temporal depth of the sacred activity at Gebel el-Silsila, and the specific relationship between quarrying and worship at the same location. Researchers found that the cliffs were systematically quarried for the sandstone used in virtually every major New Kingdom temple in Egypt, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and that this industrial extraction took place literally alongside, and in some cases within, the sacred shrines. The most perplexing discovery in recent years is a series of small rock-cut shrines, only rediscovered and properly documented by the Gebel el-Silsila survey project from 2012 onwards, that contain reliefs of deities including Sobek, Taweret, and Hapi, the Nile flood god, arranged in configurations that suggest a very specific and poorly understood ritual program connected to the annual inundation. What was the precise ceremony performed at these shrines during the flood season? And why was the act of taking stone from the earth considered compatible with, or even essential to, the sacred character of the place? Ancient Egyptians believed that Gebel el-Silsila was the source of the Nile's annual flood, the life-giving inundation that deposited the rich black silt on the floodplain and made Egyptian agriculture possible. The narrowing of the river here was understood as the physical threshold through which the floodwaters were released from the underground realm, the Nun, the primordial waters of creation, into the world of the living. Hapi, the god of the flood, was particularly venerated here, and the annual ceremonies at Gebel el-Silsila were among the most important of the Egyptian religious calendar. The quarrying of stone in this location was, in this cosmological frame, not an act of extraction but of participation, taking the sacred material of the earth and transforming it into the temples of the gods. Some scholars propose that the rock shrines of Gebel el-Silsila were primarily votive installations, small chapels erected by individual officials, quarry overseers, or military commanders to thank the gods for successful expeditions and to ensure divine favor for future operations. The prevailing theory suggests that the site's sacred character was directly linked to its function as a quarry. The removal of stone was understood as a sacred act, requiring ritual propitiation of the gods of the earth and the river, and the shrines were the institutional expression of that requirement. Others suggest that the rock shrines of Gebel el-Silsila functioned as a cosmic battery, that the concentration of divine imagery, royal dedications, and repeated ritual invocations over 3,500 years had charged the cliff face with an accumulated spiritual power that transcended any individual dedication. Could the shrines have been a symbolic representation of the entire Egyptian cosmos in miniature? The cliff as the primordial hill rising from the waters, the carvings as the activation of divine presence within the stone, and the annual flood ceremony as a reenactment of creation itself. Perhaps this was a conduit between the human world and the generative depths of the earth, maintained continuously because the Egyptians understood that the flood required their participation to be reliable. Could it be that the Gebel el-Silsila survey project's ongoing discoveries represent only a fraction of what the site contains, that beneath the accumulated debris of millennia, Beneath the waterline and within the cliff itself, there are chambers, inscriptions, and ritual installations that have never been seen by any modern eye. Some even wonder if the specific theological program of the flood shrines encodes an understanding of Nile hydrology, the timing, cause, and volume of the annual inundation, that was expressed in religious language but was based on generations of careful empirical observation. Was there perhaps a class of Egyptian priests at Gebel el-Silsila who were simultaneously hydrological monitors and religious functionaries, their rituals and their observations of the river inseparable? What exactly was done at the flood shrines during the annual ceremony? What was offered? What was chanted? What was expected to happen as a result? How did the quarrymen who cut stone from the cliff face understand their relationship to the divine presences carved into the wall beside them? How many of the thousands of graffiti at Gebel el-Silsila are still undocumented? And what names, prayers, and complaints do they contain? What lies beneath the waterline? The level of the Nile has changed over millennia, and the lower sections of the cliffs have been submerged. And what can modern survey technology reveal there? And when the last priest performed the flood ceremony at Gebel el-Silsila, did the flood still come? Gebel el-Silsila stands as a testament to the Egyptian understanding that the sacred was not separate from the material world, but embedded within it, that the stone of the cliff, the water of the river, and the image of the god were not three different things, but one thing seen from three angles. 3,500 years of continuous sacred use have left the cliffs of Silsila so saturated with human religious intention that they seem, even now, to hold something in reserve, something not yet given up to sunlight or scholarship. As we leave the sandstone cliffs of the Nile Valley and travel far to the northwest, to the rain-green fields of Inverness in the Scottish Highlands, we encounter a very different funerary landscape, one where the dead were arranged in relation to the sun and each other with a precision that speaks of profound cosmological intention. East of Inverness, the River Nairn winds through a landscape of flat agricultural fields and scattered woodland, the sky wide and changeable, the light alternating between the soft grey of cloud cover and sudden bursts of low winter sun that give the landscape a theatrical quality, long shadows and bright highlights sweeping across the fields. Near the village of Clava, in a grove of old trees whose roots have grown among the curbstones for centuries, 3 Neolithic chambered cairns and a number of ring cairns stand in close proximity, their arrangements so deliberate, their alignment so precise, that the grove feels charged with intention, even before you understand why. This is the Balnuaran of Clava, a Neolithic ritual complex near Inverness in the Scottish Highlands, constructed approximately between 2000 and 1500 BCE and comprising 3 passage cairns and several ring cairns arranged in a carefully designed spatial grouping that has been the subject of increasingly detailed archaeoastronomical analysis over the past 3 decades. The cairns are built from river boulders, each surrounded by a ring of standing stones, and each passage tomb is oriented to face the midwinter sunset, a deliberate and consistent alignment that connects Clava to the broader tradition of solar-aligned funerary architecture in Neolithic Britain and Ireland. The site was the focal point of an intensive program of community ritual investment lasting several centuries. What baffles archaeologists is the extraordinary precision of the solar alignments and the evidence that the builders went to considerable additional effort to enhance the visual experience of the winter solstice sunset. Researchers found that the stones used for the inner curbing of the cairns were deliberately graded in size. Larger and more prominent stones were placed in the southwest arc of each cairn, directly in the path of the midwinter sunset light, while smaller stones were placed in the northeast in the shadow of the sunset. The most perplexing discovery is that this grading is consistently applied across all three cairns, suggesting a deliberate aesthetic and cosmological intention. The visual effect of the midwinter sun setting behind a ring of increasingly large stones, framing the light in a graduated monumental crescendo. Who designed this, and what was the specific experience they were trying to create for the participant standing at the entrance in the last light of the shortest day? The people who built the Balnuaran of Clava cairns were part of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age population of the Scottish Highlands. Farming communities whose world was ordered around the rhythms of the agricultural year, the movements of cattle, and the demands of a climate that was, at this period, marginally warmer and drier than today. They were connected to the broader Clava cairn tradition, which encompasses several dozen similar sites scattered across the Inverness area, and they participated in a cultural exchange with the megalithic traditions of Ireland, Orkney, and the Atlantic coast. Burial at these sites was not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. The chambers were reopened, bones rearranged, and new individuals interred over multiple generations. Some scholars propose that the solar alignment of the Balnuaran of Clava cairns functioned as a chronological anchor, a moment in the year when the community gathered at the tomb to renew its relationship with the dead, to ensure the return of the sun, and to mark the turning of the agricultural year. The prevailing theory suggests that the grading of the curbstones reflects a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility combined with cosmological purpose. The builders understood that the experience of witnessing the solstice sunset was enhanced by a visual environment that directed attention toward the sunset arc, and they designed accordingly. Others suggest that the graded curbstones were not merely aesthetic, but participatory, that each stone represented an ancestor or a specific community group, and that the arrangement from smallest to largest represented a hierarchy of spiritual presence, with the most powerful ancestral forces concentrated in the direction of the dying sun. Could the midwinter ceremony at Clava have been a symbolic representation of the dead, and the sun completing a mutual journey, the sun descending into the earth, and the dead sending it back, their combined agency ensuring the return of light and warmth? Perhaps each cairn was a conduit between a specific community group and its dead, and the spatial arrangement of the three cairns at Balnuaran reflected a political relationship between three distinct kinship groups, their dead buried in deliberate alignment with each other and with the sun. Could it be that the builders of Balnuaran of Clava possessed a tradition of solar observation so precise that they could specify the exact direction of the midwinter sunset to within a fraction of a degree, and that this precision was not the product of a single observation, but of generational monitoring of the sun's movement, accumulated in memory and transmitted in architectural practice? Some even wonder if the Clava cairn tradition represents a regional school of megalithic design, a local architectural canon with specific aesthetic and cosmological rules that was taught, adapted, and applied across the Inverness Basin by a community of specialist sacred architects. Was there perhaps a lineage of cairn builders at Clava whose knowledge was as technical as it was spiritual? Who were the specific individuals interred within the Balnuaran cairns, and what status did they hold in life? Why was the passage always oriented southwest? Was there a theological reason why the entrance must face the direction of the dying sun rather than the rising one? How was the midwinter ceremony at Clava conducted? Who could enter the passage? Who must remain outside? What was placed within the chamber as offering? What happened to the Clava cairn tradition? Why did it end? And did it end abruptly or gradually? And what does the tree root growth around the curbstones today tell us about the site's long afterlife as a place of local spiritual significance? Balnuaran of Clava stands as a testament to the patience and precision with which the Neolithic mind approached the problem of death. These were not people who buried their dead and moved on. They built monuments of extraordinary care, aligned them to the sky with a precision that required decades of observation, and returned to them year after year in the shortest days of the year to stand in the last light and remember. Whatever that ceremony felt like, the cold, the long shadows, the sun sinking behind the graduated stones, it was designed to feel that way. The feeling was the point. As we leave the Highland cairns behind and journey southeast across the Mediterranean world to the Levant, we move from the well-understood British megalithic tradition into the contested landscape of early Israelite archaeology, where a single hill fort has generated more scholarly controversy than almost any other site of its size. The Eila Valley in the lowlands of the Judean foothills is a landscape of shallow, chalky soil and scrub oak. The valley floor broad and level, the hills on either side rising in smooth agricultural terraces. This is the valley where, according to the biblical account, David slew Goliath, a story that has given this particular stretch of the Judean Shephelah a permanent quality of narrative gravity. On a ridge above the valley's western edge, the carefully excavated walls of a small fortified city emerge from the hilltop in courses of dressed limestone, imposing, defensive, and 5 meters thick in places, overlooking the valley floor with an authority that needs no explanation. This is Khirbet Qiyafah, an Iron Age fortified city in the Shephelah region of Israel, occupied for a relatively brief period around 1050 to 970 BCE, and first excavated systematically by Yosef Garfinkel and Sarganor, beginning in 2007. Despite its modest size, approximately 2.5 hectares, it has become one of the most intensively debated archaeological sites in the southern Levant, because its excavators argue that it represents the earliest known example of a Judahite city, and that its existence provides material evidence for the existence of a centralized Judahite state, with implications for the historicity of the biblical David and Solomon, during a period when many scholars had argued no such state existed. What baffles archaeologists is not the city itself, but what it does and does not contain, and what either conclusion implies for the history of ancient Israel. Researchers found a highly organized urban layout within the defensive walls, featuring 2 city gates, the only known Canaanite or Israelite city with 2 gates, and a regular grid of structures along the inside of the perimeter wall. The most perplexing discovery is the almost total absence of pig bones in the faunal assemblage, a pattern interpreted by the excavators as evidence of a Jewish dietary prohibition and therefore of a specifically Israelite identity for the site's inhabitants, at a period when the existence of a coherent Israelite cultural identity has been contested. Was the absence of pig a religious practice or a social norm? And if Qiyafah was a Judahite city, what does its sophisticated fortifications say about the political entity that built it? The historical and archaeological context of Qiyafah falls at one of the most contentious junctures in biblical archaeology. The transition between the Late Bronze Age collapse and the emergence of the Iron Age polities of Canaan, including the kingdoms later known as Israel and Judah. The period of roughly 1100 to 900 BCE is poorly documented in both the archaeological and the textual record, and it is precisely in this obscurity that questions about the historical basis of the biblical narratives of David and Solomon have festered for decades. Maximalist scholars argue for a powerful Davidic kingdom. Minimalists argue that the textual evidence was written much later and projects backwards a political reality that did not exist in the 10th century. Some scholars propose that Caiapha was indeed a Judahite outpost, a fortified frontier city guarding the entrance to the Elah Valley and the highland settlements of early Judah from Philistine expansion to the west. The prevailing theory, as argued by the excavators, suggests that the two-gate design, the absence of pig bones, the pottery assemblage, and an ostracon found at the site, bearing what may be the earliest known Hebrew inscription, together constitute compelling evidence for a Judahite administrative and military presence in the Shephelah at precisely the period the biblical texts describe. Others suggest that Caiapha's cultural identity was more ambiguous than the excavator's interpretation allows, that the absence of pig bones and the presence of what looks like Hebrew writing may reflect a shared Canaanite cultural norm rather than a specifically Israelite one, and that attributing the site to a Judahite kingdom relies on a too rapid identification of archaeological patterns with textual categories. Could the city have been a symbolic representation of a border identity, an urban community that defined itself precisely by its liminal position between two cultural worlds, adopting the practices of both while belonging fully to neither? Perhaps the absence of pig was not a religious prohibition, but a political statement, a marker of alliance with highland communities whose identity was in formation. Could it be that Caiapha represents the moment at which a Judahite state identity was being actively constructed, not merely expressed in material culture, but created through it, and that the choices made by this community about what to eat, how to build, and how to write were not the product of a pre-existing identity, but the means by which that identity was brought into being? Some even wonder if the intensity of the scholarly debate around Caiapha reflects not just an archaeological disagreement, but a theological one, a contest over the historical legitimacy of foundational religious narratives that has consequences far beyond the academy. Was there perhaps a moment in this city, on this ridge above the Elah Valley, when the idea of a people called the Jews was in some very early and partial way being given permanent form? Who commanded the garrison at Caiapha, and to what authority did they answer? What was the precise function of the two-gate system, both military and ceremonial gates, or something else? What does the ostracon say, and why does its interpretation remain contested? Who abandoned Caiapha, and why was it abandoned so rapidly? The site appears to have been evacuated without the usual evidence of gradual decline. And what lies beneath the level of the Iron Age occupation, in the deeper strata of the ridge? Khirbet Caiapha stands as a testament to the extraordinary difficulty of reading the material past through the lens of textual tradition. The risk, on one hand, of confirming a narrative through the archaeology, and on the other, of dismissing genuine evidence because it challenges a consensus that was itself formed in the absence of evidence. The city is real. The debates it has generated are real. Whether David ever walked this ridge is a question that the site has not answered and perhaps never will. The stones are silent on the matter of kings. As we leave the Judean hills and travel south down the Red Sea coast to one of the most remote and least known sites in this entire journey, We arrive at the ruins of a port city that was once the gateway through which the ancient world's most coveted trade goods flowed. A city that vanished so completely that its location was disputed for decades. The Eritrean coast south of Maeshowe is a landscape of brutal beauty, salt flats and mangrove creeks on the edge of a sea that is impossibly blue, the air heavy with salt and the smell of the low tide, the horizon absolute and featureless. The summer heat here is among the most intense on Earth, the land stripped bare by centuries of grazing and deforestation, the few trees crooked and sparse. And on the coastal plain south of the modern town of Zula, beneath the salt and the sand and the accumulated sediment of 2,000 years, the ruins of one of the ancient world's most strategically important ports lie mostly unexcavated, mostly unvisited, mostly unknown. This is Adulis, the ancient Red Sea port of the Kingdom of Aksum in what is now Eritrea, active from approximately the 1st to the 7th centuries CE, and for much of that period, the most important commercial harbor between Egypt and India. Through Adulis passed the elephant ivory, tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, gold, obsidian, and enslaved people of the African interior, exchanged for the textiles, wine, glassware, and metalwork of the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant manual of the 1st century CE, describes it in detail. Byzantine ambassadors visited it. Aksum's entire commercial wealth flowed through it. And then, somewhere between the 6th and 8th centuries CE, it was abandoned and largely swallowed by the coastal plain. What baffles archaeologists is the near-total absence of systematic modern archaeological investigation at a site of this international importance. Researchers found, in 19th century survey expeditions and limited 20th century investigations, evidence of a substantial urban settlement, monumental structures, warehousing, imported pottery from across the Indian Ocean world, and the remains of what appears to be a large public building of the Aksumite period. The most perplexing discovery is a monumental Greek inscription known as the Monumentum Adulitanum, copied by a Byzantine ambassador in the 6th century and describing the military campaigns of an Aksumite king, an inscription that the ambassador found already partially buried and damaged, suggesting that even by the 6th century, Adulis was entering a decline. What actually destroyed Adulis? Was it the rise of Islam and the shift of Red Sea trade, the silting of its harbor, or a more specific catastrophe? And what remains beneath the coastal sediment that could rewrite our understanding of early globalization? Aksum, the kingdom whose commercial lifeline ran through Adulis, was one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, listed alongside Rome, Persia, and China in the 3rd century CE Mani texts. At its height, it controlled a territory stretching from southern Egypt to Yemen and was an early convert to Christianity, with the Aksumite Church forming one of the oldest continuous Christian institutions in the world. The Aksumites were sophisticated traders, literate in Ge'ez and Greek, producers of a coinage that circulated across the Red Sea world, and builders of the extraordinary obelisks that still stand at their capital. Adulis was the material expression of their commercial power, the interface between the African interior and the ocean world. Some scholars propose that Adulis declined primarily because of the disruption of Red Sea trade routes following the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, which reoriented commerce toward Arabian and Persian Gulf ports and reduced the relative advantage of Aksumite intermediaries. The prevailing theory suggests that the combination of commercial decline, harbor silting, and political instability in the Aksumite kingdom in the 7th and 8th centuries produced a gradual abandonment of the coastal city in favor of the highland capital. Archaeologists believe that the site's low elevation and proximity to the sea have made systematic excavation difficult, and that much of the ancient port lies beneath the water table. Others suggest that the story of Edulis's decline is more sudden and more violent than the gradual economic model implies, that the city may have been sacked or destroyed in the conflicts that accompanied the broader collapse of Aksumite power, and that the physical destruction of the port was a deliberate act rather than a gradual abandonment. Could Edulis have been a symbolic representation of the Aksumite state's commercial identity, a city whose very existence was inseparable from the kingdom's political power, so that when one fell, the other fell with it, neither able to survive without the sustaining energy of the other? Perhaps the port's disappearance was as sudden and as total as the kingdom's own fading from Mediterranean consciousness, a vanishing so complete that it left the modern world almost entirely ignorant of what had once been there. Could it be that Edulis, when properly excavated, would reveal a commercial and cultural complexity that would force a fundamental revision of our understanding of Indian Ocean trade in the first millennium CE, evidence of connections, of goods, of people, and of ideas moving in patterns that current scholarship has barely glimpsed? Some even wonder if the Monumentum Adulatanum inscription, whose original monument has never been found, is still out there beneath the coastal plain, buried but intact, carrying a text that could change our understanding of Aksumite history. Was there perhaps an archive at Edulis, a storehouse of commercial records, diplomatic correspondence, and geographic knowledge that was sealed or buried before the city was abandoned? What does the Monumentum Adulatanum inscription tell us about the military reach of Aksum, and what campaigns does it describe that are unattested elsewhere? What goods from India, China, and the Mediterranean have been found at Edulis, and what do they tell us about the breadth of the ancient world's commercial networks? How large was the population of Edulis at its height, and how did they live in this extreme coastal environment? What is beneath the water table at the site, and what technology would be required to excavate it safely? And when the last ship left the harbor of Edulis, where was it going, and did it know it would not return? Edulis stands as a testament to the fragility of even the most strategically vital urban centers. The speed with which a city that was once the commercial nerve center of a great kingdom can disappear from both the landscape and the historical record, leaving only the most fragmentary traces of its former importance. The salt flat above it is silent. The sea that once made it rich continues to move. Somewhere beneath the coastal plain of Eritrea, the ancient port of Edulis is waiting, unexcavated, unanswered, and unexplained. As we leave the Eritrean coast and travel northeast to the Gundaran region of what is now northern Pakistan, we arrive at a site whose identity and purpose have been the subject of debate since its first documentation. A field of prehistoric stone platforms in a landscape famous for its Buddhist heritage, but older, much older, than any monastery. The el-Silsila Valley, in what is now northern Pakistan, is a landscape of extraordinary historical density. Layer upon layer of civilization, pressed into a valley between the Margala Hills and the Salt Range, from the Indus Valley period through Achaemenid Persian rule, Macedonian conquest, Mauryan imperialism, Indo-Greek kingdoms, Kushan Buddhism, and beyond. The air is dusty and warm, the fields irrigated and green, and scattered across the valley in a concentration found almost nowhere else on Earth are the ruins of ancient cities, monasteries, palaces, and stupas that have made el-Silsila a UNESCO World Heritage Site of the first importance. But on the grounds of the great Buddhist stupa complex of Dharmarajika, beneath and around the Buddhist construction, are remains of a different kind, stone platforms whose origin lies far deeper in time. The Dharmarajika stupa complex in the Taxila Valley of northern Pakistan is best known as one of the oldest and most important Buddhist sacred sites in the world, said to have been founded in the 3rd century BCE by the Emperor Ashoka and housing relics of the Buddha. But the site's history extends far earlier. Beneath and around the Buddhist structures, archaeologists have identified stone platform features that appear to predate the Buddhist period and whose cultural attribution and function remain poorly understood. These prehistoric features, thought by some researchers to belong to the late prehistoric or proto-historic period, possibly connected to the wider Gandharan or Indo-Aryan cultural traditions of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, present a significant interpretive challenge, given the site's subsequent overlay by thousands of years of Buddhist construction. What baffles archaeologists is the question of why a prehistoric sacred site appears to have become a Buddhist one, whether the Dharmarajika stupa was deliberately placed over a pre-existing venerated location in a pattern of religious appropriation of sacred space that is found across cultures and periods worldwide. Researchers found traces of ritual activity beneath the Buddhist stratigraphy that cannot be attributed to any known Gandharan or Vedic material culture, and the stone platform features share certain characteristics with prehistoric ritual sites found elsewhere in the greater Indus-Ganges region. The most perplexing discovery is the ambiguity of the record itself. Centuries of Buddhist construction, renovation, and relic deposition have disturbed the earlier strata so thoroughly that the original prehistoric context may be irrecoverable. What was this place before it was Buddhist, and what made it sacred enough to remain in continuous use across the transition from one religious world to another? The Taxila Valley during the 1st and 2nd millennia BCE was a frontier zone between the pastoral, semi-nomadic cultures of the Iranian plateau and the settled agricultural civilizations of the Indus Plain, a meeting point for the Indo-Iranian-speaking peoples who eventually became both the Vedic tradition of South Asia and the Zoroastrian tradition of Persia. The valley's strategic position on the Grand Trunk Road corridor made it a natural node of cultural contact and exchange, and its rich agricultural land made it worth defending and inhabiting continuously from the earliest periods. Sacred sites in this landscape accumulated the investments of multiple successive religious traditions, each finding meaning in the spiritual resonance of places already saturated with human devotion. Some scholars propose that the prehistoric stone platforms at Dharmarajika represent the remains of a pre-Buddhist fire altar or sacrifice platform, a tradition of fire veneration connected to the Proto-Vedic or Proto-Zoroastrian religious practices of the Indo-Iranian peoples who passed through the Taxila Valley in the 2nd millennium BCE. The prevailing theory suggests that the Buddhist stupa was placed at Dharmarajika not despite, but because of, the site's pre-existing sacred character, a deliberate act of religious appropriation that was common practice in the spread of Buddhism across South Asia. Others suggest that the prehistoric platforms at Dharmarajika encoded a sacred geography of the landscape, a relationship between specific topographic features, celestial alignments, and the placement of ritual structures that preceded Buddhism by millennia, and that the Buddhist founders recognized and incorporated into their own sacred topography. Could the stone platforms have been a symbolic representation of a cosmic order, a map of the universe in stone, aligned to the movements of the sun or the cardinal directions that successive religious traditions recognized as fundamental and therefore preserved beneath their own constructions. Perhaps this was a conduit to a sacred dimension of the Taxila Valley's landscape that was accessible from one specific location and no other. Could it be that the prehistoric stone platforms at Dharmaraja are the most ancient surviving evidence of a sacred site tradition in South Asia that predates both Vedic religion and Buddhism by 1,000 years or more? A tradition whose name, gods, and specific practices have been entirely lost, but whose geographical imprint persisted in the landscape consciousness of every subsequent culture that moved through the valley. Some even wonder if there are more such platforms, unidentified and unexcavated, beneath other great Buddhist sites in the Taxila Valley and beyond. Was there perhaps a prehistoric sacred geography of the Indus-Ganges corridor, so systematic and so culturally powerful that it literally determined where every subsequent religious tradition chose to build? What was the specific ritual purpose of the stone platforms? Fire, offering, assembly, or celestial observation? How old, precisely, are the prehistoric features at Dharmaraja, and to what material culture tradition do they belong? What does the deliberate placement of the Buddhist stupa over the earlier sacred site tell us about how Buddhism understood and related to the religious traditions it encountered in its spread? What other prehistoric features lie beneath the Buddhist constructions at Taxila's great sites, Jaulian, Mohromuradu, Sirkap, that have not yet been identified? And what was the experience of worshipping at Dharmaraja like in the prehistoric period before the stupa existed, when the stone platforms stood alone under the open sky of the Taxila Valley? Dharmaraja stands as a testament to the palimpsest quality of sacred space. The way in which particular places in the landscape seem to attract religious attention across millennia, accumulating layers of meaning and construction until the original impulse is buried so deep it can barely be reached. The Buddhist stupa is magnificent. What lies beneath it is, in some ways, more interesting still. And what lies beneath it, the first human act of deliberate consecration at this spot, may be beyond recovery. As we leave the ancient sacred landscape of the Taxila Valley and travel west across the breadth of Asia and Europe to the green island of Anglesey off the northwest coast of Wales, we arrive at a very different kind of layered site, a Romano-Celtic settlement whose ruins have been quietly accumulating meaning in a Welsh field for 2,000 years. The northeast corner of Anglesey is limestone country, pale grey outcroppings pushing through thin, wind-cropped grass. The fields small and walled, the sea visible from every height, a constant silver presence to the north and east. The light here has a quality particular to northern islands, clear, slightly flat, giving the landscape a kind of perpetual afternoon atmosphere even in the morning. In a small enclosed field above the coastal plain, the massive limestone walls of an ancient settlement stand to a height of nearly 2 meters in places, the largest visible above a meter. The internal buildings clearly distinguishable, the whole site sitting in the open air with a completeness that most sites of its age cannot match. This is Dyn Ligwy, a Romano-British enclosed settlement on the island of Anglesey in North Wales, occupied primarily in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE during the Roman occupation of Britain and belonging to the native Celtic population of the island. Within an irregular limestone perimeter wall of enormous thickness, some sections over 3 meters wide, are the foundations of 2 round houses and 7 rectangular structures, arranged around a central open space, the whole forming a farming community of perhaps 20 to 30 individuals. It is one of the best preserved native rural settlements of the Roman period in Wales, and its limestone walls have survived 2,000 years of Atlantic weather with a tenacity that speaks to the quality of their original construction. What baffles archaeologists is the coexistence of native Celtic and Roman architectural traditions within the same enclosed space. Researchers found that the round houses at Dinligwy follow the pre-Roman native Welsh tradition exactly, while the rectangular buildings are in the Roman style. Two architectural vocabularies, two cultural identities, sharing the same perimeter wall and presumably the same community. The most perplexing discovery is that the dating evidence suggests this arrangement persisted throughout the occupation period, without the rectangular buildings progressively replacing the round houses, as one might expect in a straightforward model of Romanization. Were the round and rectangular buildings occupied simultaneously by different members of the same family? The older generation in the native style, the younger in the Roman? Or did they serve different functions, the round houses domestic and the rectangular buildings agricultural or administrative? What does the persistence of architectural dual identity at Dinligwy tell us about how native Welsh communities actually experienced Roman rule? Anglesey in the Roman period was a landscape of profound cultural significance and political tension. It had been the heartland of the Druidic tradition in Britain, the island to which Druids retreated from Roman expansion across the island, and it was the site of one of the most dramatic episodes in the Roman conquest, Suetonius Paulinus's assault on the island in 60 CE, described by Tacitus as a confrontation with lines of black-robed women and Druids screaming curses at the advancing Roman soldiers. The Roman destruction of the Druidic sanctuaries on Anglesey was, from the Roman perspective, a decisive blow against the spiritual infrastructure of British resistance. The native population that remained and eventually built Dinligwy lived in the aftermath of that cultural trauma. Some scholars propose that the dual architectural tradition at Dinligwy reflects the pragmatic adaptation of a native farming community to the economic and administrative realities of Roman occupation, adopting Roman building forms for functions that required Roman-style structures, workshops, storage, formal reception, while maintaining native forms for the most intimate and culturally charged spaces of daily life. The prevailing theory suggests that the community at Dinligwy was relatively prosperous, engaging in the Roman market economy while maintaining its cultural identity, and that the finds within the settlement, coins, Roman pottery, metalwork, attest to active participation in the colonial economy. Could it be that Dinligwy represents a form of cultural negotiation so subtle and so internally coherent that the people who lived there were simultaneously fully Roman in their economic behavior and their material consumption, and fully Welsh in their domestic architecture and their relationship to the sacred landscape of Anglesey? Some even wonder if the rectangular buildings at Dinligwy were not simply Roman in style, but were literally built by Roman craftsmen or under Roman administrative direction, while the round houses were built by the community itself, a physical manifestation of the distinction between what was imposed and what was chosen. Was there perhaps a family at Dinligwy whose internal dynamics perfectly mirrored the cultural politics of Roman Britain? A grandmother in a round house, a grandson in a rectangle, and a long evening conversation across the open courtyard about who they were. Who were the specific people who lived at Dinligwy? And do they leave any trace in the Roman administrative record? What was the community's relationship to the sacred landscape of Anglesey after the Roman destruction of the Druidic sanctuaries? Did they continue to venerate the springs and the groves secretly under the surface of Roman conformity? How did the community at Din Ligui experience the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century? As liberation, as catastrophe, or as simply another change in a landscape that had seen many? What happened to the community after the 4th century? And where did they go? And what is the Neolithic burial chamber that stands within a few hundred meters of Din Ligui, a monument nearly 3,000 years older, doing in the same field? And did its presence shape the choice to build the Roman period settlement exactly there? Din Ligui stands as a testament to the resilience of cultural identity under occupation, the way in which a community can absorb the forms of a dominant culture while preserving within its own built environment the outlines of a world that the conqueror tried to overwrite. The limestone walls are still standing. The Roman province of Britannia is long gone. Anglesey endures. As we leave the windblown island of Anglesey and travel southeast across Europe into the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, we encounter the ruins of a very different kind of civilization's capital, one that resisted Rome with ferocity, fell with catastrophic completeness, and left behind a sacred landscape of extraordinary ambition. The Șureanu Mountains in western Romania are a place of great forests and granite. The beech and fir trees dense on the slopes, the air at altitude cool and resinous, the rock emerging from the forest floor in outcroppings that seem too angular to be natural, too regular not to have been placed. At an elevation of nearly 1,200 meters, where the mountain road ends and the forest path begins, the ruins of a Dacian fortress spread across a series of terraced platforms cut into the mountainside. The stone of the walls and the sacred precincts bleached pale gray, the circular sanctuaries open to the sky, the silence broken only by the wind in the firs. This is Sarmi Zegatusa Regia, the sacred and military capital of the Dacian kingdom in what is now the Hunedoara county of Romania, occupied from approximately the 1st century BCE to the Roman conquest in 106 CE and representing the apogee of Dacian civilization. It was the seat of the Dacian king Decebalus, who twice confronted the Roman emperor Trajan in a series of wars that were among the most costly the Roman Empire ever prosecuted, and whose defeat was commemorated in the spiral narrative frieze of Trajan's Column in Rome. At its height, Sarmizegetusa Regia was a capital city of mountain fortresses, sacred precincts, and civilian settlements spread across multiple peaks of the Orashti Mountains, constituting the most ambitious urban complex in the pre-Roman Carpathian world. What baffles archaeologists is the nature and purpose of the circular and semicircular stone sanctuaries that constitute Sarmizegetusa's most enigmatic feature. Researchers found a series of large circular structures built from andesite and limestone, some featuring tall upright pillars arranged in horseshoe or full circular configurations that bear a superficial but tantalizing resemblance to the stone circles of Atlantic Europe, particularly Stonehenge. The most perplexing discovery is a large circular disc cut into a flat andesite surface that has been interpreted as a solar calendar, a device for tracking the passage of the year through the shadows cast by a central gnomon. Was this disc a functional astronomical instrument, a ritual prop, or a monument to the Dacian understanding of time? And why does a mountain fortress capital in the Carpathians share architectural features with the sacred landscapes of Neolithic Britain, 3,000 kilometers away? The Dacians were a Thracian people whose civilization emerged in the Carpathian region during the first millennium BCE and reached its greatest complexity in the last 2 centuries BCE and the 1st century CE. They were literate in Greek, sophisticated in ironworking and silversmithing, active participants in the trade networks that connected the Black Sea world to the Mediterranean and the Celtic world to the west. Their religion, about which we know frustratingly little, primarily from Roman sources that were not sympathetic observers, appears to have centered on the worship of a supreme deity called Zalmoxis, associated with immortality, and the mediation of that worship by a powerful priestly class. The Dacian priests, the Kapnobatai, are described in ancient sources as walking in smoke and communing with the divine through practices that suggest a sophisticated, shamanistic tradition. Some scholars propose that the circular sanctuaries at Samizigatusa were temples of Zalmoxis, sacred precincts in which the Dacian priestly elite conducted the ceremonies, astronomical observations, and ritual practices associated with their god's cult. The prevailing theory suggests that the solar calendar disk was a genuine astronomical device, reflecting a Dacian calendar tradition sufficiently sophisticated to track the solar year with precision, a tradition consistent with what we know of Dacian astronomical competence from other sources. Archaeologists believe that the destruction of Samizigatusa by Trajan's forces in 106 CE was deliberate and thorough, a Roman effort to erase the cultural and religious heart of Dacian identity. Others suggest that the circular sanctuaries at Samizigatusa were not merely temples, but cosmological models, 3-dimensional representations of the Dacian universe, with the circle encoding the shape of the heavens, the central pillar, or gnomon, representing the world, axis, and the assembled community of worshippers constituting the human element of a ceremony that reenacted the creation of the world. Could the horseshoe arrangements of pillars have been a symbolic representation of the solar journey, the sun's path across the sky marked in stone, so that the worshipper standing within the circle was literally positioned within the cosmos? Perhaps the sanctuaries were conduits to Zalmoxis's realm of immortality, places where the boundary between the mortal and the divine was thin enough to negotiate if you knew the right words. Could it be that the architectural parallels between the Dacian circular sanctuaries and the stone circles of Atlantic Europe reflect a genuine connection, not of direct contact, but of a shared Indo-European religious tradition spread across the continent in the 2nd millennium BCE, in which the circle was the fundamental sacred form, and the astronomical alignment of its entrance was the means of connecting the earthly sanctuary to the cosmic order. Some even wonder if the Dacian priestly tradition of Zalmoxis was, in its philosophical sophistication and its understanding of stellar and solar cycles, more advanced than the Roman civilization that destroyed it was capable of recognizing or acknowledging. Was there perhaps a Dacian astronomy, a Dacian philosophy, a Dacian body of sacred knowledge that was deliberately erased when Trajan's legions burned the mountain capital and melted down its treasures? What was the specific ceremony conducted within the circular sanctuaries of Samizigatusa, and on what days of the year? What do the tall, upright pillars within the circles represent? Deities, ancestors, astronomical markers, or something else? What became of the Dacian priests when the Roman conquest was complete? Were they killed, enslaved, or dispersed into the mountains, where their knowledge survived in oral form? What lies beneath the terraced platforms of the mountain capital that the excavations have not yet reached? And when Decebalus chose death rather than Roman captivity, cutting his own throat on a mountainside as Trajan's cavalry closed in. What exactly died with him? Sarmizegetusa Regia stands as a testament to the cost of historical conquest, not merely the political and military cost, but the epistemic one, the loss of the knowledge that the conquered possessed and that the conquerors did not understand and therefore did not preserve. Trajan's column in Rome tells Trajan's story. The circular sanctuaries on the Shurianu Mountains tell a different story, in a language we have not yet fully learned to read. The mountains kept the ruins. The Romans took the gold. As we leave the mountain fortress of the Dacians and travel west across the European plain to the chalk downs of Wiltshire in England, we arrive at a site that has been visited, studied, modified, and interpreted for perhaps 5,000 years. A long barrow whose function has generated more scholarly attention than almost any other Neolithic monument in Britain. The chalk downland of Wiltshire in southern England rolls in long, smooth waves under a sky that changes constantly. The ancient grassland pale and close-cropped, the white chalk visible where the turf is thin, the wind moving across the open ground with nothing to interrupt it for miles. Near the village of Avebury, where the greatest prehistoric stone circle in the world sits within a vast ceremonial landscape that encompasses avenues, barrows, and enclosures of extraordinary ambition. A long, low mound rises on the ridge above the Kennet Valley, turf-covered, massive, its eastern end sealed by 4 enormous sarsen stones that stand like a gateway to the underworld. This is West Kennet Long Barrow, a Neolithic chambered tomb on the Marlborough Downs of Wiltshire in southern England, constructed around 3650 BCE and used as a communal burial place for approximately 1,000 years before its passage was deliberately sealed. It is one of the largest, oldest, and most architecturally impressive chambered tombs in Britain, measuring 100 meters in length and containing 5 stone-lined burial chambers arranged on either side of a central passage. The forecourt at its eastern end, flanked by massive sarsen blocks, has the quality of a monumental entrance, a formal threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead, designed to impress and to awe in equal measure. What baffles archaeologists is the complex mortuary treatment of the human remains within West Kennet. Researchers found the bones of approximately 46 individuals deposited within the chambers, but not in the simple, undisturbed form of primary inhumation. The bones were repeatedly moved, rearranged, and sorted, with skulls and long bones grouped separately, entire skeletons disarticulated and reassembled in patterns that suggest an active, ongoing mortuary program rather than a single act of interment. The most perplexing discovery is that when the passage was finally sealed, around 2500 BCE, the chambers were partially filled with a deliberate deposit of material including chalk rubble, pottery, animal bones, and worked flint, a closing offering of some kind, as if the tomb was being ritually decommissioned rather than merely abandoned. What was happening to the bones inside West Kennet over those 1,000 years of use? And why, after a millennium of active veneration, did the community decide to seal the tomb and end the practice? The people who built and used West Kennet Long Barrow were part of the extraordinary Neolithic revolution in southern Britain. Farming communities who had arrived in the region from continental Europe around 4000 BCE and who invested a remarkable portion of their surplus in the construction of monuments to the dead. West Kennet was part of a ritual landscape that also included the massive enclosure of Windmill Hill, the Avebury Henge, and the Silbury Hill Mound, a ceremonial complex that represents one of the most sustained investments in sacred architecture anywhere in prehistoric Europe. The Neolithic people of the Kennet Valley understood the dead not as absent, but as present, as ancestral forces whose continued management and veneration was essential to the well-being of the living community. Some scholars propose that the rearrangement of bones within West Kennet reflects a sophisticated mortuary program in which the remains of specific individuals were periodically retrieved, curated, and used in rituals outside the tomb before being returned, a practice attested in other Neolithic contexts in which the physical remains of important ancestors were treated as portable, sacred objects. The prevailing theory suggests that the selective grouping of skulls and long bones reflects a belief that different parts of the body were the seat of different spiritual qualities, and that the specific arrangement of remains within the chambers served ritual purposes connected to ancestral communication or communal identity. Others suggest that West Kennet was not merely a tomb, but a portal, a constructed threshold through which the community periodically re-entered relationship with the accumulated dead, drawing on their power and knowledge, conducting ceremonies of negotiation and renewal. Could the long barrow have been a symbolic representation of the Earth's body itself, the mound as the sleeping form of an ancestral being, the passage as the spine, the chambers as the vital organs, so that entering the tomb was an act of entering the body of the ancestor and being temporarily absorbed into the long body of collective memory? Perhaps the annual or seasonal opening of the tomb was a conduit to a time before time, a ritual journey into the deep past of the community from which the participants emerged renewed. Could it be that the practice of bone rearrangement within West Kennet reflects a Neolithic philosophy of identity in which the individual self was understood as temporary and the ancestral collective as permanent, so that the process of the bones losing their individual articulation and merging into a communal deposit was not a loss, but a fulfillment, the final integration of the individual into the immortal body of the community? Some even wonder if the knowledge encoded in the arrangement of the bones, which individual was placed, where, which skull was grouped with which long bones, constituted a three-dimensional archive of genealogical and social information, a map of kinship written in the language of the dead. Was there perhaps a specialist at West Kennet, a bone keeper, a tomb custodian, whose task was the maintenance and interpretation of this skeletal archive? Who were the 46 individuals buried at West Kennet, and what distinguished them from the community members who were apparently interred elsewhere? What was the ceremony of entering the tomb, the procession, the offerings, the prayers or chants, and who was permitted to participate? What happened inside the chambers, in the dark, during the periods when the tomb was open and in use? What does the deliberate sealing of the tomb at around 2500 BCE represent? The end of a religious tradition, the displacement of an older ritual practice by a newer one, or the formal conclusion of a covenant with the dead that had run its course? And what does Silbury Hill, visible from West Kennet, mean in relation to the Long Barrow? Are they part of the same ritual program, answering each other across the Kennet Valley? West Kennet Long Barrow stands as a testament to the Neolithic understanding that the dead are not gone, that they continue to participate in the life of the community through the medium of their physical remains, that the management of those remains is a sacred obligation, and that the place where they are kept is the most important address in the landscape. The sarsen stones at the eastern end are still standing, the mound is still intact, and on winter mornings, When the low sun catches the white chalk of the facade, the barrow looks briefly like something that is still in use. As we leave the chalk downs of Wiltshire and travel north into the granite uplands of Aberdeenshire in Scotland, we arrive at the windswept hilltop of a site whose ruins represent not a megalithic tomb, but a hilltop stronghold, a vitrified fort whose construction method has puzzled archaeologists for 2 centuries. The Aberdeenshire uplands in northeast Scotland have a quality of stripped, essential beauty. The rounded granite hills running in long ridges above the agricultural lowlands, the moorland brown and gold in autumn, the sky enormous and changeable, the wind constant and cold. Dunadir Hill rises above the Garioch Valley as an isolated conical summit, its profile clean against the sky, and on its summit the remains of a medieval tower stand within the collapsed walls of something far older, a curving mass of vitrified stone fused by heat into a glassy, slag-like mass that was once a substantial Iron Age fortification. This is Dunadir Hill Fort, an Iron Age vitrified fort in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, occupied probably in the 1st millennium BCE and representing one of several dozen similar vitrified forts found across Scotland and, to a lesser extent, across parts of France and the Iberian Peninsula. The phenomenon of vitrification, the fusing of the stone walls of a hill fort into a glassy mass by intense heat, is one of the most debated topics in Iron Age archaeology. Dunadir itself is modest in scale, but it sits within a category of site that raises a fundamental question about the nature and intent of extreme heat applied to a stone and timber wall. Was the vitrification the result of deliberate construction, of accidental fire, or of deliberate destruction? What baffles archaeologists is precisely this question of causation and the implications of each possible answer. Researchers found that the temperatures required to fuse the stone at vitrified forts, estimates range from 800 to 1,100 degrees Celsius, would have required the sustained combustion of very large quantities of timber, far exceeding the amount of wood present in an ordinary timber-laced stone wall. The most perplexing discovery is that vitrification does not structurally strengthen a wall, but actually weakens it, causing the stone to crack and the wall to eventually collapse. Which means that if it was deliberate, it was not a construction technique, but something else entirely. Was the vitrification of Scottish hill forts a ritual act? A deliberate burning of a completed or abandoned fort as an act of consecration or decommissioning? Or was it the result of enemy attack, the burning of captured forts by victorious opponents? And if the latter, why did it produce such consistently and thoroughly vitrified results? The Iron Age communities of northeastern Scotland were part of the broader Celtic-speaking world of the British Isles, their society organized around kinship, cattle, and the authority of a warrior elite. The hill forts that dot the Scottish landscape were the physical expression of that elite's power, defended enclosures from which the surrounding agricultural land was administered, in which the community's surplus was stored, and in which the ceremonies that maintained social order were conducted. Scotland in the Iron Age was a landscape of competing petty kingdoms, each centered on a hilltop fort, their boundaries maintained through a combination of physical coercion and ritual alliance. Some scholars propose that the vitrification at sites like Dunadir was the result of deliberate destruction, that when a hill fort was captured by an enemy, the victor burned it to prevent its reoccupation, and that the extraordinary heat generated by the combination of the timber lacing within the walls and the accumulated organic material of the settlement produced vitrification as an incidental byproduct. The prevailing theory suggests that many Scottish vitrified forts show evidence of attack and burning, and that the pattern of vitrification is consistent with fire applied from the inside, supporting the idea of deliberate destruction by conquest or by the occupants themselves in anticipation of capture. Others suggest that the burning of a completed hill fort was a ritual act, a deliberate sacrifice of the built environment as an offering to the gods, a way of retiring a sacred space and releasing its accumulated spiritual power back into the landscape. Could the vitrified walls of Dunedin have been a symbolic representation of a completed covenant, the fort and its community having served their purpose, and the act of burning being the formal termination of that covenant, the payment of a debt to the divine world? Perhaps the fire was a conduit between the community and its ancestral powers, a spectacular, irreversible act of devotion that ensured the protection or favor of forces whose requirements were met only through total sacrifice. Could it be that vitrification was both deliberate and constructive, that the intense heat generated by the burning of a timber-laced wall was understood to transform the stone from ordinary material into a substance with special spiritual properties, a kind of archaeological alchemy in which the mundane became the sacred through the agency of fire? Some even wonder if the distribution of vitrified forts across Scotland, France, and Iberia reflects not a shared construction technique, but a shared ritual practice, a tradition of sacred fire whose meaning and purpose was transmitted across the Atlantic Celtic world through the same networks of cultural exchange that moved bronze and amber. Was there perhaps a tradition of hill fort sacrifice so widespread and so consistent that it constitutes one of the best documented but least understood religious practices of the Iron Age? Why are vitrified forts found in clusters in specific regions of Scotland? Is the clustering evidence of a specific cultural tradition, a specific enemy, or a specific geological availability of the right kind of stone and timber construction? If vitrification weakens rather than strengthens the wall, what benefit did the builders or destroyers expect from it? How long did the burning of a fort like Dunedin take, and what did the event look like from the surrounding countryside? A beacon visible for miles, or something more controlled? What became of the communities associated with vitrified forts after the burning? Did they rebuild elsewhere, or disperse entirely? And is the medieval tower on the summit of Dunedin, built from some of the same vitrified stone, an unconscious continuation of the Iron Age tradition of building on a site that had already been made sacred by fire? Dunedin Hill Fort stands as a testament to the violent, spectacular, and ultimately mysterious relationship between Iron Age Celtic communities and the built form of their own power, a relationship in which the act of destruction could be, paradoxically, the most constructive act available. The vitrified stone on the summit of Dunedin is still there, still glassy, still carrying in its fused surface the memory of a fire so intense that it altered the chemistry of the mountain itself. Whatever that fire meant, it was not an accident. It was too thorough for that. As we leave the granite hills of Aberdeenshire and travel southeast across Europe into the southern Caucasus, we arrive at a very different kind of mountain fortification, one whose position, construction, and history speak to the extraordinary strategic importance of a landscape that has always been fought over and always will be. The Roknia region of northwestern Georgia is a landscape of vertical extremes, deep river gorges cutting through forested ridges, the Caucasus peaks visible above the tree line, the air clear and cold at altitude with a transparency that makes distances deceptive. The Rioni River has carved through the limestone here over millennia, and on the rocky promontories above its tributaries, the medieval towers and fortresses of the Georgian Highland lords still command the gorges they were built to control. Above the Shaori Reservoir in the upper Rioni Valley, the walls of the Shaori fortress cling to a ridge of extraordinary defensibility, their remains still imposing despite centuries of neglect and the encroachment of the forest. Shaori Fortress is a medieval Georgian highland fortification in the Racha-Lechkumi region, its origins lying in the early medieval period of Georgian history and its later construction and occupation spanning the period of Georgian kingdom formation and subsequent political fragmentation. It occupies a naturally defensible ridgeline above the Shaori Valley with commanding views of the river approach from both directions, and its walls, towers, and internal structures, though heavily ruined, preserve evidence of a substantial military and perhaps residential complex. The fortress is one of many such highland strongholds scattered across the deeply dissected terrain of the Georgian Caucasus, a landscape that rewarded defensive architecture and punished large-scale military operations with its labyrinthine topography. What baffles archaeologists is the relationship between the fortress and the pre-Christian sacred landscape of the surrounding Racha highlands. Researchers found that the ridge on which Shaori Fortress stands had evidence of pre-medieval occupation and possibly pre-Christian ritual activity. The Caucasus Highlands are one of the regions of Europe where ancient pagan traditions persisted longest alongside Christianity, their deep mountain sanctuaries surviving in the landscape long after the formal conversion of the Georgian polity in the 4th century CE. The most perplexing discovery is the presence of what appear to be ancient sacrificial sites within and around the medieval fortification complex. The continuity of sacred use across the pre-Christian/Christian boundary at a specifically military site raises questions about the nature of the relationship between military power and religious legitimacy in the Georgian highlands. Why did the builders of the fortress site it on a ridge that was already sacred? And what was the nature of the religious practice that the medieval fortress absorbed and recontextualized? Georgia's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century CE did not erase the older religious world of the Caucasus. It overlaid it. The highland regions of Georgia, particularly Racha, Svaneti, and the mountain communities of the northeast, maintained traditions of local deity veneration, sacred groves, and ancestral shrine worship that existed in a complex negotiation with official Christianity for centuries. The Georgian mountain communities understood their landscape as inhabited by divine presences, the Kati, local deities associated with specific mountains, rivers, and passes, and the fortification of a naturally sacred site was simultaneously a military and a religious act, placing the fortress under the protection of the local divine power that already resided there. Some scholars propose that the pre-medieval evidence at Shaori reflects the general pattern of continuity of occupation on defensible ridgelines, the same topographic qualities that made a site useful for a medieval fortress had made it useful for Bronze Age and Iron Age communities before it. The prevailing theory suggests that the medieval fortress was a purely secular military installation, and that the evidence of earlier ritual activity at the site reflects the broader tradition of highland sacred sites rather than a specific, deliberate choice to occupy sacred ground. Archaeologists believe that many Georgian highland fortresses occupy sites with deep prehistory, and that the relationship between the military and the sacred at these sites is more accidental than designed. Others suggest that the siting of Shaori Fortress was deeply intentional. that the builders of the medieval fortress chose a ridge already understood as sacred because they believed that the divine protection of the place was an asset as real and as valuable as the natural topographic advantage, and that military and spiritual power were, in the Highland Georgian understanding of things, inseparable aspects of the same authority. Could the fortress have been a symbolic representation of the union of military and divine sovereignty, a physical argument that whoever held this ridge held both the valley below and the blessing of the ancient powers above? Perhaps the sacred and the secular were simply not distinct categories in the Highland Georgian worldview, and the fortress was a temple as much as it was a military installation. Could it be that the survival of pre-Christian sacred traditions at sites like Shaori through the medieval period and into the modern era, the Roknia Highlanders maintained certain ancient practices well into the 20th century, represents one of the longest-running examples of religious continuity in Europe, a living tradition that connects the present to a pre-Christian world so remote that its original meanings are irrecoverable. Some even wonder if the landscape of the Roknia Highlands constitutes a kind of open-air archive of pre-Christian Caucasian religion, preserved by the difficulty of the terrain and the independence of the communities who inhabit it, and that Shaori Fortress is one of its most complex and layered sites. Was there perhaps a mountain people at Shaori whose identity was inseparable from the specific ridge they occupied, whose military function and religious function were so intertwined that the fortress and the sanctuary were the same building? Who commanded the Shaori fortress at its height, and what territory did they control from its walls? What was the relationship between the Highland lords who occupied the fortress and the lowland Georgian kingdoms whose nominal authority they acknowledged? What pre-Christian deity or sacred presence was associated with the Shaori Ridge, and what form did the ancient rituals conducted there take? How long was the fortress occupied, and what brought its active military use to an end? And what lies within the ruins, beneath the collapsed walls and the accumulated forest debris? That systematic excavation would reveal. Shaori Fortress stands as a testament to the extraordinary layering of human time in the Caucasus, a region where Bronze Age, Iron Age, medieval, and modern histories press against each other with an intimacy found almost nowhere else in the world, each layer informed by the ones below it, none of them fully separable from the others. The mountains of Roknia are patient with their secrets. The forest grows slowly over the fallen walls. The ancient sacred presence, whatever name it bore, whatever form it took, continues perhaps to inhabit the ridge. As we reach the final moments of this journey through forgotten worlds, something begins to settle in the mind. Not answers, but deeper questions. Not clarity, but a widening sense of mystery. Across ancient chambers buried in darkness, across stone circles, aligned with unseen forces, across lost ports, hill forts, and monumental ruins scattered across continents, a single pattern quietly emerges. Human history is not a straight line. It is fragmented, interrupted, partially erased, and still incompletely understood. From the silent depths of China's subterranean chambers to the sun-baked platforms of Peru, from the mist-covered stones of the British landscape to the remote fortresses of the Caucasus, each site we explored today seems to resist explanation in its own way. Some challenge engineering knowledge, others blur the boundary between ritual and function, and many simply refuse to reveal why they were built at all. What remains most striking is not what we know, but what we still do not. The scale of these structures, the precision behind their construction, the intention that seems to echo through their design? Were these purely practical spaces, or did they serve purposes we no longer recognize? Even archaeology, with all its tools and methods, often arrives at the edge of certainty and stops there, and so we are left in a familiar place, standing between evidence and silence, between discovery and disappearance, between what was built and what was forgotten. If this journey through ancient mysteries resonated with you, consider supporting the channel. A simple like helps this work reach others who are searching for the same answers. And subscribing ensures you won't miss the next descent into the forgotten layers of human history. Because somewhere out there, hidden beneath earth, water, and time, more stories are still waiting to be found.